At exactly 8:30 that morning, I arrived at the office as usual. But today was different. It was Valentine's Day. For 10 years, I had dreamed of this moment. I believed that once Andre received my gift and read the letter that held the feelings I'd kept hidden for a decade, he would remember the little girl who had once been by his side. As I approached his office, I suddenly froze. Andre was surrounded by female coworkers, each one handing him a Valentine's gift. I understood why. He was the company's handsome and successful director. Of course, he would receive countless gifts on Valentine's Day. Even so, I waited until everyone finally left. When Andre noticed me standing quietly in the hallway, he walked over and asked, "What's wrong, Aria? Is something the matter?" I froze, clutching the gift in my hands. I'd never given anyone a Valentine's present before. Just as I gathered the courage to hand it to him, Andre interrupted me. "If there's nothing else, you should get back to work. It's time to start." Then he turned around and walked into his office without looking back. My heart sank. I carried the unopened gift back to my desk, slipped it, and the letter, into my bag, and lowered my head in silence. No matter how hard I tried to stay hopeful, I finally had to face the truth. Andre had forgotten me. The memories we shared 10 years ago were gone. And perhaps, the 10 years I had spent waiting for one person had all been for nothing. When I look back on my childhood, I can't remember a single happy memory about my family. Maybe that's why, even as a little girl, I grew up afraid of anything that had to do with love. The earliest memories I can still hold on to begin when I was about 5 years old. Back then, my parents lived with my grandmother, and my aunt's house was right next door. My mother had moved far from home to marry into my father's family. When I got older, my father told me how they had met. At the time, he was serving in the military and was stationed in the South. Somehow fate brought him together with a gentle young woman from the countryside who always wore a warm smile. To be more accurate, my father was the one who fell in love first. My mother didn't accept him right away, and my maternal grandparents strongly opposed their relationship. My father lived all the way in the north, and the distance alone was enough to worry them. On top of that, people often whispered that marrying into a northern family meant a difficult life as a daughter-in-law. They believed northern mothers-in-law were especially strict. There were demanding mothers-in-law in the South too, but southern families were generally seen as more easygoing, so people thought married life there would be less difficult. Because of that, my father never earned my grandparents' approval. It wasn't that there was anything wrong with his appearance or his personality. In fact, there wasn't much anyone could criticize. But in the end, his persistence and the feelings that had already begun to grow between them slowly changed my grandparents' minds. The day my father completed his military service was also the day my mother finally asked her parents to let her date him. After he returned to the north, they exchanged letters for several months. Eventually, my paternal grandparents traveled south with my father to formally ask for my mother's hand in marriage. At the time, my maternal grandparents were still worried about sending their daughter so far away, while my paternal grandmother wasn't particularly happy about having a daughter-in-law from the South. From the very beginning, neither family truly welcomed the marriage. Everything they feared eventually came true. Life as a daughter-in-law in my grandmother's house was never easy. I still remember the house we lived in when I was little. It was a run-down brick house with faded white plaster covering the outside walls. My father had to work far from home to provide for the family, so he only came back once in a while. My mother and I lived there with my grandmother. She had never been used to farm work, but she still went to the fields before sunrise and didn't return until late in the afternoon. My grandmother never liked her. No matter what my mother did, it was never enough. Before long, I realized she treated me the same way. Whenever my father came home, my grandmother became a little less harsh. The rest of the time, every day felt like punishment for the two of us. Even at 5 years old, I knew my grandmother didn't love me. She often scolded me and sometimes acted as if I didn't even exist. Whenever my mother came home late from the fields, I would quietly follow my grandmother around, hoping she would notice me, but she never did. Instead, she adored Aunt Chloe's children, Olivia and little Ethan. She carried them, bought them candy, and spoiled them in ways I had never experienced myself. Whenever my father came home, he always brought me plenty of treats. My grandmother would take every last one from my hands and carry them next door for Aunt Chloe's children. Back then, I was just a carefree little girl. I never understood why my mother cried every night. Or maybe I had heard my grandmother curse at her so many times that it no longer seemed unusual. It had simply become part of everyday life. But among all those memories, one day has remained clearer than any other. Even now, I can still remember it exactly as it happened. It was the morning after my father left home, following the 2 days he had spent visiting us. I was fast asleep when my grandmother's shouting jolted me awake. Oh, for heaven's sake! A daughter-in-law and her child counting every penny instead of helping this family? I rubbed my eyes and pushed myself up, still too sleepy to understand what was happening. Before I could make sense of it, my grandmother stormed into our bedroom, shoved me aside, grabbed the pillow, and pulled out the stack of cash my father had given my mother the night before. My mother rushed after her, begging her to give it back, but my grandmother flung the money across the yard. At that age, I had no idea what money was worth. Seeing so many bills scattered everywhere, I thought it must have been a fortune. Years later, I realized it was mostly small bills my father had saved little by little. My mother dropped to her knees, crying as she gathered every bill from the ground. My grandmother stood over her, throwing one insult after another. I froze where I was until I finally understood why she was so furious. She wanted to borrow the money so Aunt Chloe could add it to what she had already saved to buy a used sedan, but my mother refused. My grandmother knew my mother had the money because my father always left her some whenever he came home. As she continued yelling, I also learned that she had secretly listened outside our room the night before and heard my father hand the money to my mother. My mother kept picking up the scattered bills, and I hurried over to help her. Watching me crawl across the yard collecting the money made her cry even harder. "It's not that I don't want to help Chloe," she said through her tears. "Michael left this money for our daughter. She'll be starting first grade soon, and we still have bills to pay. How could I possibly take it?" But my grandmother had never been someone who listened to explanations. It didn't matter whether someone was right or wrong. In her eyes, she alone decided what was right inside that house. The more my mother tried to explain, the angrier she became. "You're hiding money so you can send it back to your own family. Don't stand there pretending you're thinking about this house. I knew what kind of people your family was the day they demanded all those wedding traditions before agreeing to the marriage." My mother had swallowed her feelings for years, but the moment my grandmother insulted my grandparents, she couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood up and said, "That was 6 years ago. Why do you keep bringing it up? It was just one wedding ceremony. Why can't you let it go? How dare you talk back to me? Is this how your parents raised you?" My mother raised her voice for the first time. "You can blame me all you want, but don't drag my parents into this." My grandmother grabbed a small wooden stool and hurled it at her. It missed my mother and flew toward me instead. My mother rushed over without a second thought and shielded me with her body. The stool struck her in the forehead with a dull thud. Blood began running down her face as she staggered, but my grandmother showed no sign of stopping. She kept pointing at my mother, cursing her without mercy. My mother pressed a hand against the wound on her forehead, then looked straight at my grandmother. "Who were you talking about just now? Were you cursing my parents? What have they ever done to deserve that?" Seeing my mother refuse to back down, my grandmother started screaming at the top of her lungs. "Someone save me! My daughter-in-law is trying to hit me!" By then, the neighbors had heard so many arguments from our house that hardly anyone came to watch anymore. Most of them simply pitied my mother. Aunt Chloe, however, was different. Every time my grandmother argued with my mother, she rushed over, not to stop the fight, but to take my grandmother's side. This time was no different. The moment she heard my grandmother yelling, she ran into the yard, grabbed my mother's shirt, and pulled her back. She saw the blood on my mother's forehead. She knew exactly what had happened. Even so, she never questioned whether my grandmother had been wrong. In her mind, my mother was always the one to blame. She slapped my mother twice across the face with all her strength. "How dare you raise your hand against my mother?" I burst into tears and wrapped my arms around my mother's leg. "Why are you hitting my mom?" Aunt Chloe glared at me and struck me on the head. "Get out of the way, you little brat." My head throbbed, and I cried even louder. My mother immediately stepped in front of me. "What gives you the right to hit my daughter?" Aunt Chloe yanked my mother's hair backward and shouted, If anyone dares touch my mother, I'll deal with them. I don't care who they are. Then she pointed at me. Who knows if that girl is even Michael's child? My mother's face changed instantly. Years of pain and humiliation finally erupted. She clawed at Aunt Chloe's face as she shouted, "No one gets to insult my parents or my daughter." Aunt Chloe screamed in pain. My grandmother rushed over, shoved me to the ground, pried my mother's hands away, and the two of them began beating her together. I could do nothing except cry and run to the neighbors, begging them to help us. Thankfully, a few of the men living nearby hurried over and pulled them apart. Only then did my grandmother and Aunt Chloe finally stop. By then, my mother's forehead was covered in blood, and bruises had already begun to spread across her face. My grandmother snatched up the money, then walked next door with Aunt Chloe, leaving the two of us behind. My mother cried harder than I had ever seen before. At the time, I thought she was crying because she was hurt. It wasn't until years later that I understood what truly broke her heart. She looked at me and cried. All I knew how to do was blow gently on the cut on her forehead and wipe away her tears with my little hands. After crying for a long time, she finally stopped. She washed herself, cleaned the blood from her face, and changed into the new outfit my father had bought her the day before. Then she reached into the rice container and took out several packs of candy she had hidden there for me. I happily grabbed them and started eating, completely unaware that she couldn't take her eyes off me. Tears quietly filled her eyes again. She told me over and over to be a good girl, to listen to my father, and to grow up into a kind and respectful person. I nodded again and again, too busy enjoying my candy to understand that those were the last words she would ever say to me. After that, she walked over to the cabinet and took out a bottle of sleeping pills. I watched her pour a whole handful into her palm before swallowing every last one. I simply thought she was taking medicine because she was in pain, just like I had to do whenever I got sick. Once she finished, she lay down on the bed without saying another word. I climbed onto the bed beside her and asked her to play with me, but she only smiled faintly and said she was tired and wanted to sleep. I stayed beside her for a while, then curled up next to her and rested my head on her arm before drifting off to sleep. At that moment, I felt an ache deep inside me, something cold and unsettling that I couldn't explain. I was only a child. I had no words for that feeling. It wasn't until many years later that I realized the pain had come from my heart. While I was asleep, my father's voice suddenly pulled me out of my dream. He kept calling for my mother, shaking her over and over, but she didn't respond. Her body lay completely still. He helped me off the bed and moved me aside before trying everything he could to wake her. He slipped his fingers into her mouth, hoping to make her throw up, then kept patting her back. My mother's body had gone limp in his arms. I stood there, staring, too young to understand what was happening. My father refused to give up. He poured a foul-smelling liquid into her mouth and kept trying to make her vomit. After what felt like forever, she finally threw up. Tiny white pills, already half dissolved, came out with it. Only then did my father lift her onto his back and run next door, asking Thomas, our neighbor, to help take her to the hospital. I was left alone in the house. Not long afterward, my grandmother and Aunt Chloe came over. Even before they reached the doorway, they were already complaining about my mother. Aunt Chloe spotted me standing there and demanded, "What did your mother do? Where did your father take her?" I was terrified of the way she looked at me, so I could only point at the puddle of vomit on the floor. "Mom, she took medicine." My grandmother and Aunt Chloe looked around the room until they found the bottle of sleeping pills. I thought seeing my mother like that would make my grandmother feel sorry for her. Instead, she cried out as if my mother had committed some unforgivable crime. "This family has brought home nothing but trouble," she kept shouting until my father returned from the hospital. The moment she saw him, she fell silent. My father's face was dark with anger, but he didn't say a word. He placed his old bucket hat on my head, lifted me onto his bicycle, and took me straight to the hospital. My grandfather was already there waiting for us. He wrapped me in a warm hug the moment he saw me. Ever since I was born, he had lived separately from my grandmother. He once said he couldn't stand her bitter temper anymore and preferred living on his own. I looked through the glass window and saw my mother lying motionless in the hospital bed with an IV in her arm. While I stood nearby, I overheard my father talking to Thomas. That was when I learned what had happened. Earlier that morning, Thomas had noticed my mother and grandmother arguing. Something about it had worried him, so he rode after my father to tell him to go home and check on us. If it hadn't been for his kindness, my father would never have made it back in time to save my mother's life. My father never forgot what he had done for our family. Years later, no matter how far away he lived, he always sent gifts and stopped by to visit Thomas during the holidays. I stayed at the hospital from that day on. Every evening, my father took me to wash up behind the hospital. My grandfather brought us meals every day. My mother remained unconscious, lying quietly in her bed. 2 days later, my maternal grandparents finally arrived. They lived in Texas, and back then, traveling across the country wasn't as easy as it is today. The trip took them a long time. The moment my grandmother saw my mother's bruised face, she broke down in tears. She held me tightly in her arms and cried until her eyes became swollen. My grandfather was so furious that he walked straight over and hit my father several times. He didn't stop until I burst into tears and fear. It seemed my grandparents blamed my father, and perhaps they blamed my paternal grandfather as well. No one spoke to anyone. Each family stayed in a different corner of the hospital. I saw my paternal grandfather walk over several times, hoping to start a conversation, but my maternal grandmother simply turned away. My memories of my maternal grandparents were always faint. Growing up, I had only met them twice. Both times, my mother took me to visit them. She always told them it was because the trip was too long and too expensive for us to come often. The truth was that my grandmother never wanted my mother to visit her own parents. Even so, my mother never told them what she had been going through. She kept all of that pain to herself. A few days later, my mother was much more alert. She slept less and sometimes even sat up to play with me. Every now and then, I saw her crying in my grandmother's arms. But whenever my father came into the room, she turned her face away. I think she blamed him, too. The day my mother was discharged from the hospital, she refused to go back to my grandmother's house. She insisted on staying with my grandfather instead. My father respected her decision without saying a word. My maternal grandparents stayed with us, and for the first time since arriving, they finally spoke to my father and my grandfather. My grandfather looked tense as he faced my father. "When you insisted on marrying my daughter, what exactly did you promise me?" My grandmother wiped away her tears and added, "How could anyone treat another person so cruelly? Lindsay never deserved any of this. If she hadn't been found in time, how were you going to answer for my daughter's life?" Faced with their accusations, my father could only lower his head. He didn't try to defend himself. After a long silence, my grandfather spoke again, this time with firm resolve. "If Michael can't protect Lindsay, then we're taking our daughter and granddaughter back to Texas with us. We can't leave her in that house any longer. As long as she's living with your mother, we'll never have peace of mind." The moment those words left my grandfather's mouth, my father dropped to his knees. He cried as he begged him not to take my mother away. Seeing my father break down, my mother started crying too. I was too young to understand any of it. I only knew that my parents were crying, so I ran over, wrapped my arms around my mother, and cried with them. My grandfather stood there quietly for a long time before picking me up. Looking at both of my parents, he said, "Whatever you decide, don't forget about this little girl. Adults may suffer because of their own choices, but children are innocent. Everyone makes mistakes. Please think carefully before making another one." No matter how many times my grandfather and my father apologized, my maternal grandfather refused to change his mind. He insisted on taking my mother and me back to Texas and even warned that he would take legal action if my father tried to stop us. My father remained silent. He looked at my mother, then at me. Tears kept running down his face. That same morning, he took me back to my grandmother's house to pack our belongings. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone. He would leave everything behind and move to Texas with my mother and me. When we arrived, my grandmother saw us but didn't ask a single question. That was simply who she was. It wasn't until she saw my father packing clothes into a backpack that she finally panicked. "What are you doing? Where do you think you're going?" My father kept packing until he stepped into the yard. Only then did he look at her and say calmly, "If you can't treat my wife with kindness, then we'll live our own lives. You're my mother, and I've endured everything because of that. But this time, you've gone too far." After saying that, he told me to say goodbye to my grandmother. Just as I was about to follow him, Aunt Chloe rushed over and shouted, "Have you lost your mind, Michael? If this wife leaves, you can always find another one. Are you really going to abandon your own mother?" She grabbed my father's shirt, but he shook her hand away. Pointing straight at her, he said, "I've stayed quiet because you're Aria's aunt. If you were anyone else, I wouldn't have let this go." He took my hand and started walking away. Before we left, he turned back one last time and looked at my grandmother and Aunt Chloe. "The two of you have gone too far." I could still hear my grandmother crying behind us, but I was too afraid to look back. I simply ran after my father. That afternoon, our whole family left with my maternal grandparents and began a new life in Texas. When it was time to leave, my grandfather cried harder than anyone. He held me in his arms for a long time. Before we left, he quietly slipped a few bills into my pocket along with a set of clothes. My mother kept those clothes for me for many years. We boarded the train that afternoon. It was the first train ride of my life, so I still remember it clearly. The mountains, the rivers, and the endless scenery outside the window filled my eyes. Everything seemed so vast that it left me speechless. 2 days later, we arrived in San Antonio, where my maternal grandparents lived. Their home was in a busy neighborhood. Everything there was better than what we had left behind. That was when I finally learned the truth. Back when my parents got married, my maternal grandparents had wanted my father to move in with them. But because of his pride and his determination to build a life on his own, he refused. That was why my mother had moved in with my paternal grandmother instead and endured 6 years of hardship. My maternal grandparents had only one daughter. Their land wasn't as large as my paternal grandmother's, but property in the city was valuable, and they were considered fairly well off. Living with them felt completely different. Every day I had snacks to eat and milk to drink. Those were things I had once thought were luxuries. Sometimes I wondered if my parents had chosen to live with my maternal grandparents from the beginning. Maybe my mother and I would never have suffered the way we did. After we moved to San Antonio, my mother continued treatment for depression for another 2 years. Watching her drift through each day with bottles of medicine beside her broke everyone's heart. My grandmother was still upset with my father, but as time passed, she saw how devoted he was to taking care of my mother. Little by little, both of my maternal grandparents began to look at him differently. Years later, after I had grown up, my grandfather told me something I never forgot. He said he had never hated my father. Back then, he had only been heartbroken to see his daughter in that condition, and that pain had turned into anger toward him. But the moment my father chose to leave everything behind and come to San Antonio with us, my grandfather knew he truly loved my mother. During the 2 years of my mother's treatment, she stayed home and only did small chores around the house. My grandfather helped my father find a job close to home, so he traveled back and forth every day. I attended a nearby school, and my grandfather walked me there every morning. Those years became the happiest part of my childhood. More than 2 years later, my mother's condition improved. She wasn't completely well. Sometimes she still woke up from nightmares about the years she had spent living with my paternal grandmother. My mother had always been a talented cook, so she opened a small restaurant. Her food was delicious, and the neighborhood was busy, so more and more customers began stopping by. As business improved, my father left his job and started helping her full-time because she could no longer manage everything by herself. From that point on, our family finally began to live comfortably. Back then, we only had a landline. Most people still relied on landlines at home. My grandparents' house had one with a tiny screen that displayed the incoming phone number. At the time, having a phone like that already seemed impressive. Every now and then, I noticed the same number calling. I remembered it clearly because whenever that number appeared, my grandparents and my mother always ignored it. It was Aunt Chloe calling. Every single time, my father was the one who answered. I often stood nearby, secretly listening. Most of the time, it was Aunt Chloe urging my father to come back. Sometimes, my grandmother was the one on the phone. She kept telling him to return home and even said she would find him another wife. Whenever that happened, my father would become irritated and hang up. Then he would look at me, take a few coins out of his pocket, hand them to me, and tell me to keep it a secret. He never wanted my mother to know about those phone calls. As time passed, my maternal grandparents began encouraging my mother to have another child. My father was their only son, and they also felt sorry that I was growing up without any siblings. But my mother had been deeply scarred by everything she had gone through. Combined with the years she spent struggling with depression, she tried again and again without becoming pregnant. My father loved her too much to pressure her. He never complained. He simply comforted her and told her not to worry. Even so, the memories of my childhood stayed with me. Watching my mother suffer under my grandmother's roof and seeing her battle depression left a mark on me. Little by little, I became afraid of marriage. I was only 9 years old, yet I had already decided that I would never get married. I was afraid I wouldn't find a husband like my father, and I was even more afraid that I would end up with a mother-in-law and an aunt-in-law like the ones my mother had endured. By the time I was in 7th grade, my mother finally gave birth to a baby boy. She was busy taking care of him, so besides going to school, I also helped her at the restaurant. By then, my mother's restaurant had become well known. A new university had opened nearby, bringing even more students to the area. My grandparents decided to build a small row of rental rooms next to the house for college students. It wasn't because they needed more money. They simply felt sorry for students who had to live far from home. They charged the lowest rent in the neighborhood, so most of the students stayed there until they graduated instead of moving somewhere else. One day, the tenant in the first room moved out after graduating and finding a job in another city. That same afternoon, another student came to rent the room. My grandparents were kind people, but they were careful about who they accepted. The tenants had to be real college students, and they had to seem honest and well-behaved. After talking with him for a while, they learned that he had come from Virginia to attend college in San Antonio. His name was Andre. He was in his 2nd year of college. He spoke politely and left a good impression, so my grandparents agreed to rent him the room right away. I knew everything because I was helping my mother at the restaurant that afternoon and overheard their conversation. Andre was a very neat person. Every morning, he woke up early and swept not only the walkway in front of his room, but also the entire courtyard of the rental building. Ever since he moved in, my grandmother no longer had to sweep the yard herself. She grew very fond of him. Whenever she had extra vegetables or fish, she would ask me to bring some over to him. I always paid attention to the people staying in the rental rooms, partly because I spent so much time helping at the restaurant. Most of the students ate there often because my mother always charged them less than everyone else. But I noticed something different about Andre. He never came to the restaurant. Curious, I mentioned it to my mother. She immediately scolded me. What a strange thing to worry about. Maybe our food just isn't what he likes. Don't keep talking about it. You'll only make him uncomfortable. After that, I didn't bring it up again, but I couldn't help noticing it. A few days later, Andre suddenly came to my mother's restaurant for a meal. I was surprised to see him. That day, the restaurant happened to be especially busy, and I was running back and forth trying to keep up. Seeing that, Andre rolled up his sleeves and helped me carry dishes until the crowd finally began to thin out. Only then did I remember that he had come as a customer. I smiled awkwardly and hurried to serve him his meal. Because I already liked him, I deliberately gave him a heaping plate of rice. After he finished eating, he neatly stacked his bowl and chopsticks instead of leaving everything scattered across the table like many other customers did. That made me think even more highly of him. Over the next few days, I kept watching to see if he would come back, but I never saw him again. Every afternoon, while setting up the restaurant, I found myself looking toward the rental rooms without even realizing it. Then one evening, while my family was having dinner, my grandmother suddenly mentioned Andre. She let out a quiet sigh before saying, "That poor boy, he barely has enough to support himself." I looked at her in confusion. She sighed again before continuing. "His father left him and his mother a long time ago. His mother has been sick for years. He goes to class during the day, works part-time in the afternoon, and doesn't get home until late at night." I listened quietly. I couldn't explain what I was feeling, but my heart suddenly felt heavy. My parents didn't say anything. They simply ate in silence. I thought they hadn't paid much attention to what my grandmother had said. But after dinner, my mother picked up a bag of fruit and several packs of snacks and asked me to come with her. I thought we were going to visit someone who was sick. Instead, she led me to the first room in the rental building, the one where Andre lived. Through the slightly open door, we saw him sitting alone, quietly eating instant noodles. My mother looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes seemed to grow moist. Then she gently knocked on the door. Andre immediately stood up and greeted us politely. Good evening, ma'am. Hi, Aria. Is there something you need? My mother smiled warmly. Your uncle came back from a family gathering today and brought home too much fruit and too many snacks. We couldn't possibly finish them all, so I thought I'd bring some over for you. Thank you, man, Andre replied with a grateful smile. I stood there in silence because I knew my mother wasn't telling the truth. On the way home, I finally asked, Mom, Dad bought those for me. Why did you tell him they came from a family gathering? My mother gently patted my head. Sometimes a small, harmless lie is the kindest way to give someone help without making them feel embarrassed. That's a good thing, too. It was a lesson about giving and receiving that I have never forgotten. Back then, I spent most of my time helping my mother at the restaurant. The truth was, I enjoyed selling food much more than studying. Whenever my parents asked what I wanted to do when I grew up, I always grinned and answered, I'm going to take over Mom's restaurant. That answer worried both of them. By the end of the first semester of 8th grade, my grades were only average. My father was furious. After he came home from the parent-teacher conference, he walked around with a dark expression that scared me to death. Even my grandparents noticed how angry he was. They usually spoiled me and took my side, but after looking at my report card, even they could only shake their heads. My grandmother sighed for a long time before turning to my mother. Why don't we ask Andre to tutor Aria? He's an excellent student. My mother said she would think about it, but I immediately objected. It wasn't because I disliked Andre. I was embarrassed. I didn't want him to find out how poorly I was doing in school. But in this situation, my opinion didn't matter. With grades like mine, my father was never going to let me spend my days doing whatever I wanted. The very next day, my father went to speak with Andre. I knew nothing about it because I had already left for school that morning. Years later, I learned that my father had to persuade him for quite a while before he finally agreed. Andre had been reluctant because he didn't want to trouble our family. Just like that, I ended up with an unexpected tutor. That evening, I was sprawled on the couch watching television when I suddenly heard Andre greeting my grandparents behind me. I jumped in surprise. Still completely confused, I turned around and asked the most awkward question possible. Andre, what are you doing here? He smiled and answered so casually that I almost fell off the couch. I'm here to tutor you. My grandparents burst into laughter. Meanwhile, I broke into a cold sweat. My peaceful days were officially over. Under my grandparents' orders, I had no choice but to follow Andre upstairs to study. My grandparents' house had a second floor, and I had my own room. Andre was always thoughtful. When he came into my room, he left the door wide open and sat beside me, making sure to keep a respectful distance. Even so, I was a stubborn kid. I was annoyed with him for agreeing to tutor me. Seeing him stare at my report card and sigh over and over only made me even more irritated. After studying it for a while, he turned to me and asked, "Which subject do you think you're struggling with the most?" It was a perfectly normal question, but to me, it sounded like he was making fun of my grades. I mumbled, "I don't know." He lightly tapped me on the forehead. It hurt enough to make me stare at him in surprise. He looked at me seriously. "I'm asking you a serious question. Answer me." I pouted and complained. "Why did you hit me? You're older than me." "Exactly," he replied. "I'm older than you, so why can't I?" I had always been mischievous, so I immediately teased him. "You're 7 years older than me. You're basically an uncle, not a big brother." He could only shake his head helplessly before saying, "You little troublemaker." After I teased him for a while, Andre immediately wrote down a math problem and told me to solve it. The smile on my face disappeared at once because I had no idea how to do it. He looked at me in disbelief. "This is 6th grade math. You're already in 7th grade. How can you not know this?" That time, I really had nothing to say. He filled page after page with problems and asked me to work through them, but I couldn't solve a single one. In the end, he realized I was struggling in every subject. The next afternoon, I didn't see him anywhere, and I was secretly thrilled. I thought he had finally given up because I was such a hopeless student. But around dusk, I saw him riding his bicycle back with a stack of books piled so high behind him that it almost reached his shoulders. The moment I saw him carrying those books toward our house, I had a bad feeling. He came over and told me it was time to study. I immediately tried to make excuses. "I'm helping Mom at the restaurant." Before Andre could answer, My mother looked at me and said, "Go home and study. You don't need to help here." I had no choice but to leave, grumbling to myself the whole way. Andre placed a stack of 6th grade textbooks on my desk. The stack came up to my face. I was still upset that he kept making me study. So whenever my parents weren't around, I deliberately called him Uncle, just to annoy him. But the moment my parents appeared, I sweetly called him Andre, as if nothing had happened. Sometimes I knew I was being rude, but teasing him like that was the only way I could get back at him. He had one habit that drove me crazy. Whenever I lost focus or couldn't answer a question, he would tap me on the head. It hurt every single time. I always got angry, but there was nothing I could do because I was the one who couldn't keep up. After each lesson, if my mother was still busy at the restaurant, Andre stayed to help clean up. It was usually late by then, so he always told me to go home and get some sleep for school the next day. That was one of the reasons I appreciated him so much. My parents always saved him a late dinner. At first, he refused every time. It wasn't until they told him it was leftover food that hadn't sold that he finally accepted. Even then, he found ways to repay their kindness by helping wash dishes or going to the market with my father to carry supplies. Because he was so thoughtful and considerate, my parents grew even fonder of him. Since I had fallen behind in every subject, teaching me wasn't easy. He had to review everything I had missed while also keeping me caught up with the lessons my classmates were learning. As I gradually began to understand more, I got tapped on the head less often. Once I started solving problems on my own, I didn't dislike him as much anymore. I had to admit he was incredibly smart. Every subject seemed easy for him. Sometimes I deliberately picked difficult questions from advanced workbooks, hoping to stump him, but he solved them almost immediately. Because he spent so much time tutoring me, he no longer had time for his part-time job. My parents offered to pay him, but he refused every time. When my father tried to put money into his hand, he gently pushed it back and said, "I think of Aria as my little sister. Please don't make this feel like business." My father insisted for a while, but eventually gave up. Hearing Andre call me his little sister irritated me for reasons I couldn't explain. Without saying a word, I stepped on his foot as hard as I could before turning around and walking outside. Since Andre refused to accept money for tutoring me, my parents also refused to charge him rent. He tried to protest, but they wouldn't change their minds, so in the end, he accepted, thanks to his patience. And because I finally started taking school seriously, mostly because I was afraid of being punished by my father and getting tapped on the head by Andre, my grades improved dramatically. By the end of the second semester, my average scores had gone up. My parents were overjoyed to see my grades improve. My father immediately asked Andre to keep tutoring me through 9th grade so I could pass the entrance exam for high school. During the summer before 9th grade, I felt like I grew up overnight. My complexion became clearer, my hair grew longer and smoother, and I could tell my body was changing. All summer long, Andre and I studied together at the library because there were more books there. Besides, my father had warned me that if I failed the high school entrance exam, he would make me quit school and get married early. That was the one thing I feared the most, so I finally began taking my studies seriously. Andre taught me all kinds of things, and little by little, my way of thinking began to change. I started enjoying learning. Even so, I never gave up my habit of teasing him by calling him uncle. By the time I entered 9th grade, Andre was still patiently tutoring me. One day, while he was explaining a lesson, I sat there daydreaming and staring out the window. He called my name several times, but I didn't hear him. Finally, he tapped me on the head. I snapped back to reality and looked at him. He sounded a little upset. "Instead of paying attention, you're off in your own little world." I quickly shook my head. I wasn't. His expression softened a little. Andre had a way of explaining things that was easy to understand, and I learned quickly once I paid attention. Before long, my grades improved again. By the end of the first semester of 9th grade, I was already earning above-average marks. Even my homeroom teacher was surprised by how much I had improved. My parents couldn't thank Andre enough. They appreciated him more with each passing day. By the second semester, Andre was busy preparing for his college graduation exams, so we didn't have much time to study together. We used every spare moment we could find. Sometimes we even ate sandwiches while reviewing lessons for the afternoon. Around that time, my grandparents were having part of the house renovated. The work was close to my room, so it was noisy and filled with dust. Because of that, I carried my books to Andre's room instead. His room was small, but tidy. There was only one desk by the window, so the two of us had to sit close together while we studied. Andre had always been serious and respectful, so my mother never worried about me studying in his room. Every evening, I brought a plate of dinner over, and we ate while reviewing lessons. I still remember one evening when I walked over to study as usual. The door to his room was closed but unlocked, so I pushed it open without thinking. What happened next is something I still remember with embarrassment. Andre had just stepped out of the bathroom after his shower and hadn't gotten dressed yet. I froze in the doorway, my face instantly burning. Andre looked just as shocked. He grabbed a towel and rushed back into the bathroom. I skipped our study session that night. For the next several days, I avoided him whenever I saw him because I was too embarrassed to face him. It seemed Andre felt the same way. Whenever we happened to run into each other, he would blush slightly and look away. But after I skipped too many lessons, my parents started wondering what was going on. I was still too embarrassed to face Andre, but they thought I was simply being lazy. A few days later, my father practically dragged me to Andre's room and told me to study properly. He stood outside, making sure I stayed there. Andre and I were both awkward, but we pretended everything was normal until my father finally walked away. Only then did we both relax. While I was still too embarrassed to say anything, Andre spoke first. About what happened the other day. Let's just forget it. I quietly nodded. Even so, I knew it wasn't something I could forget that easily. After that, Andre gradually went back to treating me the way he always had. It took me much longer before I could finally act normal around him again. Around that time, my mountain bike broke down and had to be taken to the repair shop. No one knew what was wrong with it, and the mechanic told my father it would take a while to fix. My parents were busiest in the mornings because the restaurant was always crowded, so my father couldn't take me to school. Andre volunteered to drive me instead. He woke up incredibly early. By 5 o'clock every morning, he was already out for a run. As for me, I always slept until the last possible minute before school. But from the day he started taking me to school, he stood outside waiting for me every morning. Because he was waiting, my father came into my room every day to drag me out of bed. I always climbed out reluctantly, still half asleep. While my father was complaining about how lazy I was, Andre suddenly said, "She's not tired, she's just lazy. If you trust me, let me help her build the habit of exercising." Before I even had time to react to what he had suggested, my father nodded immediately. "That would be great. She's always been too lazy to exercise. That's why she's so weak and gets sick all the time." And just like that, my peaceful life came to an end. I disliked Andre so much that while sitting behind him on the bicycle, I secretly pinched him hard in the side whenever I had the chance. From that day on, he woke me up every morning before sunrise to go running. I had never exercised much before, so I got out of breath after only a short distance. But Andre insisted that I finish an entire lap around the park before I was allowed to rest. During the first few days, I would wait until he ran ahead, then sneak over to a bench and hide there. Every single time, he found me and made me get up and finish the run. Whenever I got home, my legs felt so weak they could barely hold me up. Yet my father couldn't have been happier. From then on, I had to run every single morning. While my bicycle was being repaired, Andre kept taking me to school. But he usually finished class about 10 minutes later than I did, so every afternoon I had to wait for him outside the school gate. By then, I had already grown into a teenage girl, and quite a few boys at school had started noticing me. Whenever they saw me standing there by myself, several of them would come over, start a conversation, and offer to give me a ride home. I turned them all down. One of them, though, refused to give up. His name was Logan. I called him by his first name because we were the same age. Even though I had made it clear that I wasn't interested, he kept following me around. Just like that afternoon, while I was waiting for Andre, Logan stood beside me again and insisted on taking me home. No matter how many times I refused, he stayed right there, hoping I would eventually change my mind. Luckily, Andre showed up a few minutes later. The moment Logan saw him, he quietly walked away. For some reason, I felt like Andre wasn't in a good mood. During the ride home, he barely said a word to me. That felt strange because he usually talked to me the whole way. It wasn't until we were almost home that he finally asked, sounding a little irritated, "Who was that guy?" I didn't think much of his attitude, so I answered honestly. "Oh, him? He likes me. He wanted to take me home today, but then you showed up." Andre looked straight ahead and said, "Why didn't you just go home with him?" I noticed the annoyance in his voice, but I didn't pay much attention to it. The afternoon sun was blazing, and I was tired and hungry. I didn't feel like thinking about anything else. The more I stayed quiet, the more upset he seemed. It wasn't until a few days later, after I explained that I didn't like Logan at all, that Andre finally relaxed. But then, out of nowhere, my father asked Andre to keep taking me to school. His reason was simple. It was on the way, and he didn't want me skipping school or running around with boys. Years later, I found out the truth. Andre had been the one who told my father that I was getting old enough for boys to start paying attention to me. Just like that, he became my fitness coach, my tutor, and my driver all at once. Looking back, there was one good thing about it. Ever since Andre started taking me to school every day, far fewer boys tried to ask me out or invite me to go places with them. Before long, it was time for our entrance exams. It was an important season for both of us. I was preparing for the high school entrance exam, while Andre was getting ready for his college graduation exams. Whenever we had free time, we buried ourselves in our books. Sometimes the pressure became overwhelming, and I wanted to take a break. Whenever Andre noticed me pouting, he would smile and say, "Hang in there. After the exams, I'll ask your mom if I can take you out for a day." I held on to that promise and kept studying. Andre's exams came before mine. On the morning he left for the exam, I didn't know what else to do for him, so I woke up early and brought him a bowl of noodle soup for breakfast. He had always been an excellent student, so I wasn't very worried about him. That whole morning, I stood outside my mother's restaurant, absent-mindedly waiting for him to come back. When it was finally my turn to take the exam, Andre insisted on taking me there. Before I walked into the testing room, he called me over and handed me a brand new pen. "For good luck," he said. I don't know whether it was because Andre had prepared me so well or because his encouragement gave me confidence, but I felt that I did well on the exam. When I walked out of the testing room, I saw him waiting outside. Later, I found out that he had stayed there the entire morning, waiting for me to finish. I was deeply moved. That evening, Andre went over the exam questions with me. Thankfully, I had answered almost all of them correctly. My chances of getting into high school looked very good. Andre kept his promise. That evening, he asked my mother for permission to take me out for a little while. My mother hesitated at first, but Andre assured her, "I'd like to take Aria for a walk around downtown. I'll have her home before 9. Hearing that, my mother finally agreed. It wasn't even 6 o'clock yet, but I skipped dinner and hurried out with him. Andre was already waiting on his familiar bicycle. He rode me into downtown San Antonio. I was thrilled because my parents were always busy with the restaurant, so they rarely had time to take me anywhere like this. I sat behind him with my arms around his waist. His clothes carried the fresh scent of fabric softener. He took me to a small shop that sold hair accessories and bought me a sparkling bow-shaped hair clip. After that, we wandered through the food stalls. We each bought a grilled ear of corn before walking to a nearby park to eat together. I had always been clumsy. After only a few bites, bits of corn were already stuck around my mouth. Andre kept looking at me, and I became so embarrassed that my face started to burn. My imagination immediately ran wild, filling my head with scenes straight out of a romantic movie. I panicked and stammered, "Why are you looking at me like that?" Andrea slowly leaned closer. My heart started pounding. I squeezed my eyes shut and stayed completely still because his face was getting closer and closer. Then I felt something lightly touch my cheek. When I finally gathered the courage to open my eyes, I realized he was simply using a handkerchief to wipe away the bits of corn from the corner of my mouth. I had misunderstood everything. Thinking back on it still makes me blush. I quickly turned my face away while Andre burst into laughter. "What were you thinking?" Too embarrassed to answer, I snatched the handkerchief from his hand and wiped my mouth myself. After we finished eating, I sat on the bench, gently swinging my legs while looking up at the evening sky. Andre sat quietly beside me. After a while, he asked, "What do you want to do when you grow up?" I shrugged. "I don't know. I'll finish high school first and figure it out later." He seemed a little disappointed, but didn't say anything right away. A moment later, I asked, "What do you want me to do?" He thought for a while before answering, "I think you should study accounting. It'll give you a lot of opportunities in the future." I simply nodded because I couldn't even imagine what an accountant actually did. A strong breeze swept through the park, sending flower petals drifting through the air. The flowers settled gently in my hair. I didn't bother brushing them away. I just sat there enjoying the cool evening breeze. Andre quietly reached over and picked the blossoms from my hair one by one. I stayed perfectly still while he did it. "These flowers keep getting caught in your hair," he said with a smile. "Long hair really suits you." I was still too young to think much about what he meant. I simply smiled and thanked him. Later, he took me for another walk through the night market. He asked if there was anything I wanted, and he promised to buy it for me. But I knew he was still a college student with very little money, so I didn't ask for anything. After taking me around for a while, Andre stopped in front of a stationery store. He picked out a purple fountain pen and gave it to me. I looked at the gift with curiosity. Andre smiled gently and explained, "If I give you an ordinary pen, you'll throw it away once the ink runs out. But with a fountain pen, you'll keep refilling it and using it for a long time." I happily accepted the gift. While he wasn't paying attention, I secretly picked out another fountain pen. It wasn't until we were on the way home that I asked him, "After you graduate, you'll still stay here with me, won't you?" My question seemed to catch him off guard. He slowed the bicycle and fell silent for a few seconds before answering awkwardly, "I can't answer that yet. Give me a few more days, okay?" 15 minutes later, it was almost 9 o'clock when he stopped his bicycle in front of our gate. Before I went inside, I quietly slipped the fountain pen into his hand. "This is for you." He opened the box and saw that it was exactly the same fountain pen he had given me. He laughed. "What kind of guy uses a purple pen? You really are something." Even so, he quickly tucked it into his pocket. His smile was brighter than ever, and I could see how happy he was. After that evening, the two of us became much closer than before. Since the exams were over, my parents let me rest for a few weeks, so I didn't have to study anymore. During those days, Andre often took me to used bookstores to look for reference books for the new school year. On the way home, he would stop by the same park where we had eaten grilled corn together. We sat there eating ice cream and reading books. Before I knew it, the day he had promised to answer my question was almost here. That night, I took out the handkerchief I had accidentally kept after our last outing. I planned to return it to him the next morning and finally hear his answer. Part of me wanted to keep it, but I was too embarrassed to do that. In the end, I tucked it under my pillow and went to sleep. I had already gotten used to going on morning runs with Andre. At daybreak, I put on my running shoes and waited for him at the front gate. But something felt strange. He was always the one waiting for me. Why hadn't he shown up yet? After waiting for a while, I walked over to his room. The door wasn't locked. Feeling uneasy, I pushed it open. Everything inside was exactly the same, but Andre wasn't there. I tried to reassure myself that he had probably gone out for a while. Just then, my father walked over. His sudden appearance startled me. "Looking for Andre?" I nodded quietly, my eyes still searching the room. My father continued, "You ran out so fast this morning that I couldn't catch you. Andre went back to Virginia. His mother got sick, so he had to leave in the middle of the night. He left his belongings here and asked your mother and me to take care of them." I listened in disbelief. After a long pause, I finally asked, "Did he say when he'd come back?" My father slowly shook his head. He looked just as disappointed. "Probably not. His mother is sick, and she's all alone. He has to stay there and take care of her." A hollow feeling spread through my chest. I couldn't even describe the confusion inside me. I forced myself to hide the sadness in my eyes, said goodbye to my father, and walked away. I still went for my morning run. I ran faster and faster, as if I could leave all of those feelings behind. But the moment I was out of sight of the house, I stopped beside a tree, buried my face in my hands, and burst into tears. You're right. Only after Andre left did I realize how empty everything felt without him. I missed him so much. Through my tears, I kept asking why he had left without saying a single word to me. After crying until I had no strength left, I went back home and threw myself onto my bed. That entire day, I felt as though I had fallen from the sky into a deep abyss. Only after he was gone did I realize that I had come to rely on him so much. But I hid all of those feelings because I was afraid my parents would notice something was different. I forced myself to smile and chat with them as if nothing had happened, even though my heart was filled with sadness. It wasn't until 2 days later that I finally stepped into his room. Everything was still exactly where it had been. Nothing had changed except for one thing. Andre was no longer there. I sat down at his desk and absent-mindedly pulled open the drawer. Inside was a small piece of folded paper. I carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was hurried. Aria, I'm sorry for leaving so suddenly. I had to leave in the middle of the night, so I couldn't come upstairs to wake you. I hope you won't be upset. Please study hard while I'm away. If we're meant to meet again, we will. There were only a few short lines, but before I knew it, tears were already streaming down my face. I clutched the letter tightly in my hand as I cried without stopping. I kept hoping Andre would come back, but no matter how long I waited, he never appeared. Every day, I stayed close to the telephone at home because my father had told me that before leaving, Andre had asked for our phone number and carefully wrote it down on a piece of paper. I waited and waited, but he never called. Summer passed, and he still didn't return. Only then did I finally accept that he had truly left. I kept telling myself that I would forget someone as heartless as him, someone who had left without contacting me even once. But deep down, I missed him terribly. Having him beside me had quietly become a part of my everyday life. My parents cared about Andre too, so they decided to leave his room exactly as it was instead of renting it out to someone else. From that day on, I began using his room as my study room. After months of waiting for him in disappointment, I finally went back inside. The room was covered in dust, and it took me an entire day to clean it. The dust made my eyes sting until they turned red. It was only because of the dust, not because I was crying. I took Andre's bicycle to a repair shop so I could ride it to high school. My parents were surprised that I suddenly wanted to use an old bicycle instead of asking for a new one, but since it was what I wanted, they agreed. As I was getting my books ready for the new school year, I found a cardboard box under Andre's bed. Inside were all of his high school textbooks. He had carefully saved them for me. Throughout the books, he had marked important sections with a pencil and written little notes for me to pay attention to. He had even left behind his college textbooks. A note on top of the box read, "I'm leaving these for you. I hope they'll be useful." I hated him. He had already left me, yet he had still left behind so many things that made it impossible for me to stop thinking about him. I took out the 10th grade textbooks and closed the box again. I remembered that Andre had once told me to study accounting, so I made that my goal. One day, my mother took me shopping for a white graduation dress. She opened the wardrobe and brought out several bundles of brand new white fabric. Smiling, she said, "Andre bought these for you. He asked me to keep them hidden so we could surprise you with your white graduation dress. He cared about you so much, so make sure you study hard. Don't let him down." I tried to act as though nothing was wrong and simply nodded, but my lips trembled and my eyes quickly filled with tears. Throughout high school, I kept riding Andre's old bicycle to school, and I continued using the fountain pen he had given me. As time passed, things gradually changed. Most of my classmates had already started riding small motorcycles, but I was still on that old bicycle. They often laughed at me for being old-fashioned, but I didn't care. It was the only way I could ease the feeling of missing him. When I entered college, I chose accounting as my major. The notebooks Andre had left behind happened to be from the exact same major I was studying. By then, most of my female classmates had begun following fashion trends. They dyed their hair and dressed stylishly, but I stubbornly kept my long black hair and still wore the white dress Andre had bought for me. No matter what anyone said, I didn't care, because that was how he had liked it. During my college years, many young men pursued me, but I turned every one of them down. After graduation, I struggled to find a job because every company wanted applicants with experience, and I had none. At that time, my younger brother was still in school, and my maternal grandparents were getting older. My family's finances had to be divided among many responsibilities. I couldn't bring myself to ask my parents to spend a large amount of money helping me secure a job. For months, I carried my resume from one company to another, only to return home disappointed every time. If there was one place I had always dreamed of working, It was Stonebridge Financial Group in downtown San Antonio. Ever since I was a college student, I had hoped to work there one day. The company had recently opened a new branch in Texas, while its headquarters remained in Virginia. Even though the branch was new, it was still a large company, so getting a job there was far from easy. I couldn't even get hired by small companies, so working at Stonebridge felt like nothing more than an impossible dream. After failing to find a job for so long, I accepted a part-time position as a cashier at a supermarket. I was disappointed because the work had nothing to do with my major, but I had to earn money to support myself first. I was an adult now, and I could no longer keep asking my parents for money. After working odd jobs for a while, I continued applying everywhere I could, but they were all part-time positions unrelated to my major. Before I knew it, a whole year had passed. Around that time, Stonebridge Financial Group announced that it was recruiting young talent. I heard there was a new director who wanted to reorganize the company, so I quickly prepared my resume and submitted it to Stonebridge. Looking at my resume, with only a few words under work experience, I couldn't help feeling nervous. Aside from my degree, there was nothing particularly impressive about me. When I arrived at the company, I saw a mountain of resumes stacked together. My confidence immediately disappeared. There were so many applicants. Who knew if they would even get to mine? Still, since I had already come all the way there, I decided to submit it anyway and leave the rest to chance. A few days later, to my surprise, I received a phone call inviting me to an interview. I was so excited that I could hardly sleep. On the day of the interview, however, reality quickly hit me. There were countless applicants waiting outside, all interviewing for accounting positions just like mine. Everyone was well-dressed, stylish, and confident. Seeing them made my own confidence disappear. As I listened to them talking about their previous work experience, I became even more certain that I would be eliminated. By the time my interview began, I had already accepted that I probably had no chance. The interview panel consisted of several senior department managers who had worked at the company for many years. They looked through my resume, then looked at me. I couldn't help thinking they were wondering how someone with a resume like mine had dared to apply. They didn't ask many questions, only a few basic ones that were similar to every other interview I had attended. When it was over, I thanked them and left. I walked home convinced that there was no hope this time either. A few days later, while I was preparing my resume to apply somewhere else, I unexpectedly received a call from Stonebridge. They invited me to come in the next day to begin work. For a moment, I thought I had heard wrong. I shouted with excitement and immediately ran to tell my parents. That night, I was so happy that I couldn't fall asleep. I was hired into the accounting department. Surprisingly, I was the only new employee assigned there. I couldn't understand it because many applicants from the same interview had stronger qualifications and more experience than I did. Yet somehow, I was the one they had chosen. I didn't know whether it was simply luck or whether someone had shown me unexpected favor. Whatever the reason, seeing how warmly everyone welcomed me made me feel incredibly fortunate. Everyone in the office kept talking about the company's new director. They said that was the reason for all the recent personnel changes. Since I had just joined the company, I had never met him myself, so everything I knew came from my coworkers. According to them, the director was a young man who had recently returned from studying abroad. In the eyes of the employees, he was friendly and capable. Ever since he had taken over the company, he had introduced many new benefits for the staff. Even so, hardly anyone had actually met him in person. "Do you know the director's name?" I asked one of my coworkers with a smile. She looked at me and laughed. "You're so clueless. His name is right there on the company notice." I smiled awkwardly before walking over to the bulletin board. The name in front of me made my heart skip a beat. Andre Smith. It was a name I knew all too well. In an instant, every memory of him came rushing back. It was the name I had buried deep inside my heart, hiding every beautiful memory I had of him. My chest suddenly tightened, and my heart ached. Anything that reminded me of him always hurt. What a coincidence. This man's name was exactly the same as his. When I first started working there, I wasn't very confident in my abilities. But after some time, I realized I wasn't as incapable as I had thought. Everyone patiently guided me, and I learned quickly. There was another employee around my age named Paige, and before long, we became close friends. We had breakfast together almost every morning and usually left work together in the evenings. Being the same age and getting along so well made us even closer. Everything might have continued peacefully if that woman hadn't appeared one morning. The sharp sound of her high heels striking the floor echoed through the office, instantly getting on my nerves. As if that wasn't enough, she raised her voice and shouted, "Where's Andre?" She barked the question so abruptly that no one even knew who she meant. There was more than one employee named Andre in the company, and other departments had people with the same first name as well. Asking a question like that without giving a last name left everyone confused. Because of that, no one answered her. She seemed unable to control her temper. She marched over and swept the stack of documents off my desk with one motion. I didn't think she had done it on purpose. My desk just happened to be closest to the entrance. She continued yelling, "Is everyone here mute? I've been asking a question, and nobody's answering me." I had always been a straightforward person, and I could be stubborn too. Seeing her behave like that, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I raised my voice and said, "Excuse me? Who exactly are you looking for? Why are you shouting like this?" The moment I spoke, several coworkers quickly motioned for me to stop. They were probably afraid the argument would get worse or simply didn't want trouble in the office. But I had never been the type to back down. I looked straight at her and waited for an answer. She strode toward me and snapped, "Why do you care so much? I'm looking for Andre. Didn't you hear me?" I gave a faint smile. "I think you've misunderstood what I meant. I'm asking which Andre you're looking for. There are several people here with that name. And judging by the way you're speaking, you seem educated. So why are you acting like someone with no manners?" As soon as I finished speaking, several people nearby immediately covered their mouths, trying to hold back their laughter. She immediately flushed with embarrassment and lunged at me as if she wanted to hit me. But just as she raised her hand to slap me, I reacted faster, grabbing her wrist and twisting it behind her back. She cried out in pain, but I didn't loosen my grip. As I forced her arm farther behind her, I raised my voice. "I've been treating you with respect this whole time, young lady. I figured you're still young, but where did you learn such awful manners?" Even though she was hurting, she still refused to back down. She struggled wildly while threatening me. "Let go of me right now. If you don't, you'll lose your job today. Remember this, I am the director's fiancé. Go ahead and lay another hand on me. We'll see if you don't all get thrown out of this company." The moment she claimed to be the director's fiancé, I hesitated for just a second. Taking advantage of that brief moment, she broke free from my grip. She turned to leave, but I quickly rushed over and blocked the doorway. "Move!" she shouted at me, but I remained where I was. I had already thought it through. We'd clashed anyway. Even if I backed down now, there was no guarantee she would let me off the hook. So no matter what happened, I was going to teach her a lesson about her arrogant attitude. I pointed at the sign hanging by the entrance and asked, "Can you read what that sign says? Authorized personnel only. Even if you were the director's own mother, if you're not an employee here or don't belong to this department, you should at least know how to behave." She lifted her chin arrogantly and brushed my hand aside. "Finished preaching? Now get out of my way." I was just as stubborn. Holding the door firmly, I said, "If you want to leave, pick up every single document you knocked onto the floor first." Realizing she couldn't force her way out, she finally bent down and gathered all the papers before placing them back on my desk. Only then did I let her leave. After she was gone, everyone immediately gathered around me, saying I had been incredibly brave. From them, I learned that her name was Madison. Rumor had it she was the director's fiancé, although no one had ever confirmed it. No one had ever seen her appear together with the director either. They had only seen her coming to the company over and over again to make trouble. Everyone had chosen to put up with her because no one wanted to argue with someone so unreasonable. Besides, if she really was the director's fiancé, upsetting her could easily cost them their jobs. Seeing me finally teach her a lesson seemed to satisfy everyone. After she left, they surrounded me, unable to hide their excitement. "Aria, you don't look it, but you've got guts." Watching you put her in her place felt so satisfying. Several of my coworkers praised me, although a few were still worried about whether I would lose my job. I could only smile awkwardly because, deep down, I had already prepared myself for that possibility. Strangely enough, more than a week passed, and nothing unusual happened. Madison never came back to the company, and my work continued exactly as before. Gradually, I stopped thinking about the incident. As time went on, everyone in the department kept worrying about me, but nothing ever happened. Perhaps because of what I had done that day, I left quite an impression on my coworkers. They gradually became friendlier and talked with me more often. It even seemed that Susan, our department manager, had started to like me more after that incident. She patiently taught me many things and entrusted me with more responsibilities. This time, the company had launched a new project, and I was assigned to calculate and balance the project's financial figures. For someone who had just graduated, it was a heavy workload, but I accepted it without hesitation. I wanted to prove myself, so the more difficult the task was, the more determined I became. Everything from upper management reached me only through email or through Susan, so I had never met any of the executives in person. More than a month later, as the project moved into full operation, my workload became heavier and heavier. I was working overtime almost every evening and hardly had time to spend with Paige anymore. Ever since I started working at this company, I had rented a small apartment near the office to make commuting easier. My parents' house was simply too far away to travel back and forth every day. Work had become so busy that I often didn't get back to my apartment until late at night, completely exhausted. The next morning, I was scheduled to attend an important meeting with everyone involved in the project. Yet it wasn't until 9 o'clock that night that Susan sent me another message, leaving me scrambling to finish everything before forcing myself to get some sleep so I could wake up early the next day. It was my first time attending such a major meeting, and I couldn't help feeling nervous. I arrived early and kept my head down, checking the documents in front of me one last time to make sure every number was correct. One by one, the attendees began entering the room. They were all important figures within the company. I jumped to my feet and greeted each of them one after another like a machine. Once everyone had taken their seats, Susan turned to me and reminded me, "Make sure you're ready. You'll be presenting in a minute." Just as I was taking a deep breath to gather my courage, the conference room door opened. The director walked in. I froze where I stood. The man standing before me was Andre. I couldn't believe it. Never in my wildest dreams had I imagined that the person standing right in front of me would be Andre. The man I hadn't gone a single night without thinking about. The man who had entered my life so suddenly, only to leave just as suddenly, taking my foolish young heart with him. My eyes burned, and tears began to gather. I stared at him so intently that while everyone else lowered their heads to greet him, I remained rooted to the spot. "Aria, get ready to present," Susan urged, snapping me back to reality. Startled, I finally came to my senses. Fighting through my confusion, I took a deep breath and walked to the front of the room to begin my presentation. As I passed by him, I noticed him looking at me, but I quickly avoided his gaze. I stood at the front of the room while Andre turned his chair slightly toward me, resting one hand beneath his chin as if listening attentively to my presentation. Those 10 or maybe 15 minutes were the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. I never once looked in his direction. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the report in front of me. Perhaps because of that, I managed to finish my presentation without falling apart. After I returned to my seat, everyone moved on to the discussion, but I couldn't hear a single word. My mind was completely filled with him. I stole glance after glance at Andre, greedily taking in every feature of his face. I couldn't help feeling jealous of time itself. It seemed as though the years had forgotten him. He still looked just as young and gentle as he had back then. The only difference was that he had become more mature, more composed, and more distinguished. As I looked at him, I found myself thinking that if no one else had been in that conference room, I would have run straight into his arms and held him tightly. I would have told him how much I had missed him all these years. The meeting eventually came to an end, but I couldn't remember a single thing that had been discussed because I hadn't been paying attention for even a moment. Susan and I stayed behind to tidy up the conference room after everyone else had left. As we were gathering the documents, Andre remained behind as well. He looked at me and asked Susan, "Is she a new employee?" My eyes widened in surprise. All this time, I had convinced myself that he remembered me, that he still remembered the girl who had shared a part of his youth with him. But I had been wrong. That one question made it painfully clear that he didn't remember me at all. A wave of disappointment crashed over me. I hated him. I bit my lip tightly, struggling to hold back the hurt that threatened to overwhelm me. While I had been lost in my own fantasies, I had imagined deliberately staying behind so he would have a chance to speak with me alone, so we could spend just a little more time looking at each other. but I had only been fooling myself. I swallowed my heartache, nodded in response to his question, and quietly excused myself before leaving the conference room. I returned to my desk feeling completely defeated. Everything inside me seemed to collapse. If only that man hadn't been Andre. If only he had never appeared. I could have continued waiting for him with all my heart, just as I had for all these years. He had forgotten me. He no longer remembered the girl who had studied with him or gone running with him every morning. I was the only fool who had held on to this hopeless love, keeping every precious memory of him, from the beautiful moments we shared to every little gift he had ever given me. What was I supposed to do now? Cry? Go to him and force him to remember me? Wouldn't that be ridiculous? Now that he was the director of this company, if I approached him like that, wouldn't it look as though I was trying to claim a connection with someone successful? I lowered my head onto my desk, carefully hiding the tears that had quietly begun to fall. Just then, my eyes fell on the stack of documents that had been stained the day Madison came to the office and threw everything onto the floor. I suddenly froze. That day, she had declared with complete confidence that she was the director's fiancé. My heart skipped a beat. For nearly 10 years, I had locked myself inside the prison of the promise Andre had left behind, faithfully waiting for the day he would return. I had turned down so many people who had pursued me simply because I couldn't let go of the dream of being with him. And now he was about to get married. So all these years, I had wasted my youth on a love that had become one-sided. I was the only one left heartbroken, drowning in pain. I went into the restroom and tried to calm myself down. I splashed cold water onto my face again and again, hoping it would clear my mind. When I returned to my desk, I hesitated for a long time before finally opening a blank resignation letter and beginning to type. But after only a few lines, I deleted everything. I couldn't allow myself to become an irresponsible person. The project I was working on was still unfinished. I couldn't let my personal feelings interfere and leave a mess for everyone else to clean up. I made up my mind. Even if I eventually resigned, I would leave with my head held high, not sneak away like someone who had failed. So what if Andre had forgotten me? Maybe that was for the best. It would make it easier for me to let go. At least I wouldn't have to force myself to act awkwardly or avoid him every time we crossed paths. That was what I kept telling myself. But my heart refused to listen. It felt as though there were a wound buried deep inside it, aching quietly without end. In that moment, my heart continued to ache with a dull pain. That night, I stayed late at the office again. Susan had to leave early to take care of her young child, so I volunteered to finish her share of the work. It wasn't because I wanted to earn favor. Growing up, I had watched my mother struggle to take care of my younger brother, so I understood how difficult it was. I simply wanted to help Susan however I could. My mood was terrible that evening, so I didn't even feel like eating. Since lunchtime, all I had consumed was water. The truth was, I wasn't hungry at all. I buried myself in my work, hoping it would distract me from the sadness weighing on my heart. When I finally looked up, the clock had already passed 9 o'clock. I couldn't believe how quickly time had gone by. I was about to head home when I noticed there was still a little work left, so I sat back down to finish it. Footsteps echoed through the hallway outside, but I paid little attention. I had already grown used to it. Back when I first started staying late, those footsteps used to give me goosebumps because I was afraid of ghosts. Eventually, I realized it was only the security guard making his rounds. Since I worked late so often, the guards had become familiar with me, so whenever I heard footsteps around this time of night, I automatically assumed it was one of them. The footsteps drew closer, and I smiled to myself. Thinking it was the security guard as usual, I looked up and greeted him cheerfully. "Working late again tonight?" But the words caught in my throat. The person standing in the doorway wasn't the security guard, it was Andre. He stood there quietly, looking at me. There was no reply, but there was something unusually gentle in his eyes that I couldn't understand. Flustered, I quickly stood up. "I'm sorry. I thought you were the security guard." He showed no reaction to my awkward explanation. Instead, he walked over to my desk and asked, "Why are you still here at this hour?" "I still have a little work left to finish." He casually flipped through the documents on my desk before pulling up the chair beside me and sitting down. "Do you live far from here?" Someone else might have been touched by his concern. but hearing those words from him only made me uncomfortable. They reminded me that he had forgotten everything about me. Unable to hide my frustration, I replied coldly, "You don't have to worry about me. I live nearby. I'll head home when I'm finished." He remained calm. "I'm working late too. If you're done soon, I'll drive you home." Without taking my eyes off the computer screen, I answered indifferently, "No, thank you. I don't want to trouble you. It'll be a while before I'm finished. You should go ahead." Perhaps he sensed the distance in my voice because he didn't stay any longer. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket, took out a piece of candy, and placed it on my desk. "I'll head out first. Finish up and go home soon. Skipping meals isn't good for you." Then he walked away. I stared at the candy lying on my desk, feeling strangely upset. Back then, giving me candy had been something he did only for me. After all these years, he still had the same habit. But it wasn't something special anymore. It was simply how he treated women. The thought made me feel even more bitter. I wanted to throw the candy away, but in the end, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I quietly slipped it into my desk drawer. That night, back in my tiny apartment, I couldn't fall asleep no matter how hard I tried. Everything that had happened that day felt like a dream. If only it really had been a dream. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Andre standing beside Madison. I couldn't stop wondering whether he had loved other women during the nearly 10 years we had been apart. The more I thought about it, the more my heart ached. I felt hurt, resentful, and heartbroken because he had forgotten me, and forgotten the promise he had made all those years ago. As work became busier, I found myself seeing him more and more often during meetings. He was always calm whenever we faced each other, while my heart was thrown into turmoil every single time. No matter how hard I tried to push him out of my mind, the moment I saw him, everything inside me became a tangled mess again. Halfway through the project, we had to work closely with several business partners, so meetings became even more frequent. Among the company's major clients was a man named Ethan. It seemed he had started to take an interest in me. During meetings, he rarely challenged me or questioned my professional opinions. Most of my suggestions were accepted almost immediately. I noticed the special attention he showed me, and apparently everyone else noticed it too. Susan couldn't have been happier. After every meeting, she would tease me with a smile. "Aria, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Ethan is the son of the chairman of a major company. If you marry into that family, you'll never have to worry about money again." But I didn't feel anything for Ethan. The truth was, no matter how angry or disappointed I felt, there was still only one person living in my heart. I couldn't stop loving Andre. Whenever Susan tried to encourage me to get closer to Ethan, all I could do was smile awkwardly. Today was a special day. Or rather, a strange one. Andre unexpectedly walked into our office. Everyone gasped in surprise. It was the first time they had ever seen the director come to our department in person. He was carrying several bags of pastries. Walking over to me, he said, "Aria, take these and share them with everyone." With so many people watching, I had no choice but to accept the bags from him. I couldn't act distant the way I had before. As I handed out the pastries, the women in the office couldn't stop talking about how handsome the director was. I listened to all their compliments unwillingly while passing the snacks around. When I reached Paige, I noticed that she was staring at Andre without even blinking. She didn't seem to realize I was standing right in front of her. Judging by the sparkle in her eyes, I guessed she liked him. Then again, it made sense. None of the women in the office seemed immune to his charm. After I finished handing everything out, I returned to my desk. Since my desk was close to Susan's, I could clearly hear their conversation. Andre was looking through some documents on her desk before saying, "The meeting with our business partners has been moved to tonight. Please arrange for someone from your department to attend." Susan hesitated. "My little boy is sick, and my husband is away on a business trip. I don't know what to do." Andre folded his arms, remaining as calm as ever. "If you can't make it, send someone else in your place." As he spoke, his gaze shifted in my direction. Paige was sitting beside me, so I couldn't tell whether he was looking at me or at her. I glanced over at Paige. Hope was written all over her face. She seemed to be waiting for Susan to choose her, but Susan's next words shattered all of her expectations. "Then Aria, Arrange your work and attend in my place tonight. I couldn't refuse. Susan was my manager, and besides, I was responsible for this project. Meeting with our business partners was naturally part of my job. I quietly agreed, but when I turned toward Paige, I saw the disappointment in her eyes. She couldn't take her eyes off Andre. Before leaving, he turned to me and said, "Text me your address. I'll pick you up around 7 tonight." Before I had a chance to respond, he was already gone. Susan smiled and said, "Just let him drive you. It wouldn't make sense for the director and one of his employees to arrive separately for a meeting with our partners." I reluctantly nodded. Paige finally spoke, and there wasn't the slightest hint of friendliness in her voice. What a fuss. Since when does a director have to pick up an employee? She stopped there, but I knew exactly how unhappy she was. I didn't respond. The entire afternoon, Paige didn't say another word to me. I left work early to get ready for the dinner. Earlier, Susan had already sent me Andre's phone number, so I texted him the address of the street near my apartment. I didn't give him the exact location where I lived. It wasn't that I was overthinking things. I simply didn't want to trouble him. I put on a simple white chiffon dress. After carefully brushing my long black hair, I left it loose over my shoulders. It had been a long time since I had dressed so softly and elegantly. I waited for him by the roadside. Countless people passing by turned to look at me. Perhaps I looked unfamiliar to them. A black sedan pulled up in front of me. Andre stepped out, looking as handsome and refined as ever. I had imagined seeing him like this countless times in the past. Yet now that he was standing right before me, all I felt was sadness. My heart ached. I quietly opened the rear door and sat in the back seat. I didn't dare sit beside him. Throughout the drive, neither of us said a single word. I pretended to look out the window at the passing streets, although from time to time I secretly glanced at him. It seemed he was watching me through the rearview mirror as well. The dinner was held at an elegant restaurant. It was my first time visiting a place like that, so I couldn't help feeling a little nervous. I followed a few steps behind Andre. I usually wore sneakers, so I rarely put on high heels. Even though these heels weren't very high, they still felt awkward. Just as I had expected, they caused trouble. As I stepped into the elevator, I suddenly lost my balance and nearly fell. Fortunately, Andre reacted quickly and caught me around the waist. We found ourselves standing face to face inside the elevator, with no one else around. The closeness between us made me feel embarrassed. After that unexpected moment, I hurriedly regained my composure and stepped out of his arms, putting a little distance between us. He remained perfectly calm and simply asked, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Thankfully, the elevator doors opened at that exact moment. I quickly hurried out, avoiding his gaze. My face was burning, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like a drum. Ethan was also attending the dinner as one of the company's business partners. Seeing me dressed like this seemed to catch him by surprise. The moment he spotted me, he enthusiastically pulled out a chair for me. Without hesitation, he sat down right beside me, leaving me seated between him and Andre. The atmosphere suddenly felt suffocating. Ethan had already shown an interest in me for quite some time, so with an opportunity like this, he made no effort to hide his enthusiasm. He kept serving food onto my plate and pouring drinks for me, paying no attention to the fact that Andre, the host of the evening, was sitting right beside me. Everyone noticed and immediately began teasing him. Well, looks like Ethan has finally found the one. He seems happier than ever tonight. The two of you look great together, sitting side by side." Their endless teasing made my face grow warm. With every toast, I raised my glass. I had never been able to hold my liquor well, so after only a few drinks, I was already starting to feel dizzy. Perhaps it was the alcohol, but the way Ethan looked at me seemed gentler than before. From time to time, I secretly glanced toward Andre, yet he remained perfectly calm, drinking and chatting with everyone as if nothing around him mattered. For some reason, I suddenly felt angry with him. He was sitting right next to me, yet he didn't recognize me at all. Back then, when he came to pick me up from school and saw other boys surrounding me, he would become furious. And now, here I was, sitting beside him while another man openly showed interest in me, yet Andre remained completely indifferent. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I hated him. I lifted my glass and drank. Every time someone offered me another toast, I accepted it. Ethan seemed bolder than usual that evening, constantly trying to take care of me. Seeing me drink so much, he repeatedly tried to stop me. By then, I was already feeling lightheaded. When another glass was placed in front of me, I reluctantly reached for it. Just as I was about to drink, Andre suddenly turned toward me and stopped me. "You've had enough. Don't drink anymore." But I had always been stubborn. The more he tried to stop me, the more determined I became. A small part of me even felt satisfied seeing that he seemed bothered because of me. As I stubbornly lifted the glass again, Andre reached over, took it from my hand, and drained it in one swallow. The dinner soon came to an end. I swayed slightly as I struggled to stand up. Everything in front of me was becoming blurry, but I was still aware of what was happening. Seeing that I was unsteady on my feet, Ethan hurried over to support me. "I think you're drunk. Let me take you home." Before I could even smile and thank him, another hand suddenly wrapped firmly around my wrist. Through my hazy vision, I turned toward the person beside me. It was Andre. He pulled me toward him so suddenly that I stumbled straight into his arms. Then I heard him say in a firm voice, "I'm sorry. Aria is my employee, so it's my responsibility to take her home. Besides, she came here with me." With that, Andre led me away, leaving Ethan standing there in stunned silence. Even though I was still conscious, my body refused to cooperate. I stumbled along beside him like a kite caught in the wind. I remembered him helping me into the car. Perhaps alcohol really did make people bolder. The moment I reached the car, I kicked off my uncomfortable high heels, climbed in barefoot, and collapsed onto the seat. I was exhausted. As soon as I got into the car, I fell asleep. It wasn't until much later that I learned I had been leaning completely against him the whole way, even resting my head on his lap as I slept peacefully. When the car stopped near my apartment, I climbed out and started walking barefoot as if on instinct. At that point, I had no idea what I was doing anymore. Andre quickly followed after me. The path leading to my apartment was covered with gravel, and he was afraid I would cut my feet. Even though he kept trying to pull me back, I stubbornly shook him off. In the end, he had no choice but to scoop me up into his arms. Only then did I finally settle down. I buried my face against his neck. It reminded me of the old days when I used to sit on the back of his bicycle. He still smelled the same, carrying that simple, clean scent of fabric softener. Nothing about him seemed to have changed. The only thing that had changed was that he no longer remembered me. Tears suddenly began to fall. All the hurt and loneliness I had buried inside for so long poured out at once. After asking around for directions, he finally found my apartment. It was the first time a man had ever brought me home, and I was completely drunk, so naturally the neighbors couldn't help but stare. When he gently laid me down on the bed, one shoulder of his shirt had already been soaked by my tears. The moment I left the warmth of his arms, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Slurring my words, I mumbled, "You mean, old man? Are you just going to leave me here?" Back then, whenever I teased him or pretended to be angry, I always called him old man. So in my drunken haze, that old habit slipped out again. I cried as I called out to him, my hands reaching blindly through the air, trying to find him. Everything before my eyes had become a blur because of the alcohol. All I could sense was his breathing drawing closer and closer. Then my cold lips slowly became warm. I felt something soft lingering gently against them. After that, I drifted deeper and deeper into a dream-filled sleep. The next morning, I woke up with a splitting headache. My throat was so dry that I immediately started looking around for water. There was already a glass of cold water waiting on the table beside my bed. Without thinking, I grabbed it and drank it in one long gulp. Still feeling groggy, I climbed out of bed. I was still wearing the same dress from last night's dinner. I let out a long yawn before sitting there blankly, trying to remember how I had gotten home. As soon as I cracked open my door, my neighbor, Miss May, gave me a mischievous wink. "So you've been hiding a boyfriend all this time? Who is he? He's pretty handsome." I was still frowning, trying to piece together everything that had happened the night before, when she glanced toward the hallway and continued, "Speak of the devil. There he is." I turned around and froze. It was Andre. Why was he here at this hour? He even seemed to be carrying breakfast. A cold sweat instantly broke out across my back. My hands began to tremble. I quickly made up an excuse to end the conversation with Miss May and hurried back into my room, hoping I could hide. But there was nowhere to hide. A moment later, Andre pushed the door open. Seeing me pretending to lie on the bed, he simply said, "You're awake. Go wash up and come eat breakfast. Why are you still lying there?" He switched on the lights before walking into the tiny kitchen to unpack the food. Left with no choice, I quietly went into the bathroom to brush my teeth and wash my face. My toothbrush and towel had already been laid out neatly for me. I couldn't help appreciating how thoughtful he was. But then my eyes suddenly widened. Hanging on the rack was a colorful collection of my underwear. I nearly choked in embarrassment. If he had prepared my towel and toothbrush, that meant he had come in here. And he had seen all of that. My face burned bright red. When I finally stepped out of the bathroom, he was already sitting there waiting for me. My cheeks were still glowing with embarrassment. He must have thought I was still hungover because he asked, "Are you still drunk? Why is your face so red?" I awkwardly shook my head. He handed me a pair of chopsticks. "Sit down and eat. If you're not feeling well, you can take the day off." I obediently did as he said. After eating a few bites, I hesitated before asking softly, Did you stay here all night?" He looked at me with a hint of reproach before replying, "If I hadn't stayed, where else was I supposed to go? You're a grown woman, yet you drank until you completely lost control and caused all kinds of trouble. At this rate, you'll never find a husband." The way he scolded me was exactly the same as it had been years ago whenever I did something wrong. For a brief moment, I felt strangely happy. It had been so long since I had experienced something so familiar. But the happiness quickly gave way to sadness as memories of the past came flooding back. I hurriedly finished my breakfast, trying to push those painful emotions aside. After we finished eating, he cleaned everything up before leaving for work. I sat there absent-mindedly, trying to remember what had happened the night before, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember anything. With some food in my stomach, I finally felt a little better. I decided to go to work. Taking a day off felt like wasting my salary, and besides, I still had a mountain of work waiting for me. I hated taking a day off because it meant losing part of my paycheck. Besides, I still had a mountain of work waiting for me. As soon as I walked into the office, everyone gathered around me, eager to ask about last night. Khan was the first to speak. "So? How did it go with the director? Did anything happen?" I shook my head repeatedly. "Nothing happened. We just had dinner with the clients, that's all." The truth was, I couldn't remember much of anything. Susan laughed as she held up her phone. "Oh, come on. You're trying to hide it. Ethan posted photos from last night on Facebook." Startled, I hurried over to look. In one photo, I was smiling brightly while raising my glass with everyone else. In another, my face was already flushed from the alcohol. But the most dangerous photo of all was the one showing me stumbling as I left, with Andre supporting me. I stammered, trying to explain myself. I just drank a little too much. But I still made it to work this morning, didn't I?" Just as I was awkwardly laughing and trying to defend myself against everyone's teasing, Andre suddenly walked into the office carrying a shopping bag. Without saying anything, he walked straight over to my desk. "Your shoes. You left them in my car last night." My face instantly turned bright red as I hurriedly accepted the bag from him. Thankfully, he left immediately after returning them. But that only made things worse. Every excuse I had just made completely fell apart. Khan chuckled. "You're really good at keeping secrets. If something's going on, just tell all of us. We'd be happy for you." I'm telling the truth. The more I denied it, the more everyone teased me. "Go for it. The director isn't married yet. Don't let someone else beat you to him." "Who says he has a fiancée? That whole thing about Madison being his future wife is just something she made up herself. Nobody has ever confirmed it." "Come on, Aria. You can do it." While everyone continued laughing and teasing me, I noticed that Paige looked anything but happy. When I returned to my desk, I heard her mutter something under her breath. She spoke very quietly, but I still heard every word clearly. "She's just another woman trying to throw herself at the director." I pretended not to hear her and quietly sat down to continue my work. Ever since that day, I noticed Paige had become much colder toward me. As the project gradually entered its final phase, the workload only became heavier and more urgent. Because of that, I was staying late at the office almost every night to finish everything on time. That evening was no different. I was still sitting at my desk, checking the unfinished reports in front of me. Just as exhaustion began to creep in, I suddenly noticed a cup of hot tea and a slice of cake being placed gently on my desk. I looked up and saw Andre standing there, watching me. "You're still here at this hour?" he asked. "If you're working late, don't skip dinner. You'll end up with a stomachache." After saying that, he pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. He quietly ate his cake and drank his tea with me. It wasn't the first time this had happened. Throughout the following nights, almost every evening that I worked late, he would show up with a late-night snack for both of us. We would simply sit there eating together, rarely saying a word. During those quiet moments, he seemed far more relaxed than he ever was during work, no longer wearing that calm, composed expression he always showed everyone else. There were nights when I accidentally fell asleep at my desk from exhaustion. Whenever I woke up, I would find a jacket draped over my shoulders. There was only one person who could have done that. To him, perhaps these small acts of kindness meant nothing, but he had no idea how much they hurt me. Every thoughtful gesture only reminded me of the past and left my heart aching all over again. If only he understood everything I had been carrying inside all these years. After spending so much time around him again, I realized the feelings I had buried deep inside had never truly disappeared. Yet I began telling myself that maybe it was finally time to let the past go. I even started thinking about staying here instead of resigning. After all, this job suited me well. My coworkers were kind, and I genuinely liked working here. The only problem had always been me. I was the one who couldn't let go of the past. Back then, I had only been a 10-year-old girl, clinging to a childish crush without understanding what love really was. Andre had been 23, yet he had never once confessed any feelings to me. Perhaps everything had existed only in my own heart. Perhaps I had simply loved too deeply on my own. I finally made up my mind. Maybe it was time to let go of all the feelings I had been holding on to for so many years. From now on, I would treat him as nothing more than an ordinary person, just like everyone else. Maybe then, everything would become much easier. Just when I had finally made up my mind, fate seemed determined to play another cruel joke on me. Somehow, it led me straight into another heartbreak because of Andre. That afternoon, while I was buried under a mountain of paperwork, Paige stormed into the office once again. Her face was dark with anger as she marched straight to my desk and started causing a scene. "You! What makes you think you can flirt with my fiancé?" For a moment, I was stunned by her accusation. Then I quickly collected myself and immediately realized she was talking about Andre. There had to be some misunderstanding because I had never done what she was accusing me of. I forced myself to remain calm and replied, "First, this is a workplace. Please show some basic courtesy. Second, my personal life is none of your business, so I have no obligation to answer your questions." Even though I spoke as politely as I could, Paige only became more aggressive. With one furious sweep of her arm, she knocked every file off my desk, sending papers flying across the floor. The last time she came here making trouble, I had stood up to her, so my coworkers were no longer as intimidated by her as before. This time, the moment they saw her crossing the line, everyone immediately stepped in. Khan hurried over and pulled her away from my desk while the others bent down to help gather the documents scattered across the floor. Although I was still shaken, I instinctively glanced toward Paige. She remained calmly typing on her keyboard, making no attempt to get involved. Seeing that left me feeling unexpectedly hurt. As everyone tried to hold Paige back, she became even more hysterical. Pointing directly at me, she shouted, "If you're so confident you've never flirted with my fiancé, then answer me this. Why did he spend the night at your apartment after the client dinner? And why have you been using overtime as an excuse to stay here talking with him every single night in this office?" Every accusation she threw at me caused more eyes to turn in my direction. The sympathetic looks I had been receiving slowly turned into suspicion. I stood there speechless. In a situation like this, every explanation would only make me sound guiltier. Just then, a familiar voice came from outside the office. "Who's been talking about me?" Every head turned toward the doorway. Andre had arrived. I only found out later that Susan had called him to tell him what was happening. The moment Paige saw him, the fierce expression on her face disappeared. She immediately put on a sweet, delicate act and hurried over to him. "Andre, What took you so long? Your employee has been bullying me. Andre answered coldly, This isn't a place for you to come. But she... Paige immediately pointed at me. Andre followed her gaze. At that moment, I felt like a guilty criminal standing under everyone's suspicious eyes. Without saying another word, he calmly walked over to me, bent down, picked up the remaining papers scattered across the floor, then gently asked, Are you all right? I gave a small shake of my head, but that simple gesture only made the whispers around the office grow even louder. Seeing that, Paige rushed over again. Andre, what's wrong with you? I'm your fiancé. The office erupted into another wave of murmurs. Her words only made the situation even more complicated. Andre turned to look at her, his voice filled with disbelief. Who told you we were getting married? Everyone froze. Then he continued calmly. Our families arranged this marriage, but from the very beginning, I've made it clear that I don't agree to it. Paige immediately protested. But your father already decided. Andre cut her off before she could finish. That doesn't mean I've accepted this marriage. From now on, stop coming here and harassing my employees. It was the first time I had ever seen Andre lose his temper. His voice was much harsher than usual. Not only was he telling everyone the truth, but he was also pulling me out of this impossible situation. Only then did everyone finally stop looking at me with suspicion and begin whispering about Paige instead. Unable to bear everyone's whispers any longer, Paige stormed out of the office. Even as she was leaving, she didn't forget to glare at me and warn, Stay away from Andre. Once she was gone, the entire office immediately broke into loud conversations. She was acting like she already owned the company just because she had a meaningless title. Some of my coworkers even came over to comfort me. Poor Aria. You got dragged into this for no reason. Someone else joked. The director was clearly protecting you just now. Maybe you should take this chance and become our future CEO's wife. I knew they were only trying to lighten the mood, so I forced a smile and laughed along. Just then, Paige suddenly slammed her hand against the desk with a loud bang. Can you all keep it down? How is anyone supposed to work with all this noise? The entire office instantly fell silent. Everyone stared at her in surprise. Paige had always been gentle, and she was a new employee just like me. No one expected such a strong reaction from her. A little while later, she quietly apologized to everyone for losing her temper, but somehow that only left me feeling even more uneasy. I couldn't focus on my work for the rest of the afternoon. After thinking it over for a long time, I finally made up my mind to resign. I wanted to put an end to all of this as quickly as possible. I didn't even have the courage to print out my resignation letter and hand it to Susan myself. Like a coward running away from her mistakes, I secretly emailed it to her instead. Almost immediately, she replied with a short message. This isn't within my authority. You'll need to meet with the director in person. I let out a quiet sigh. The last person I wanted to face right now was Andre. But I knew I couldn't keep running forever. Ever since I was little, I had hidden inside the shell of my own fear. I didn't want to get tangled up in any more complications. Taking a deep breath, I gathered my courage and walked toward his office. It almost seemed as though he had been expecting me. The door wasn't fully closed, only slightly ajar. The moment he saw me hesitating outside, he called me in. I inhaled deeply before stepping inside. It looked as though he wanted to say something first, but I interrupted him. Andre, there's something I'd like to say. His eyes dropped to the paper in my hand, and he frowned slightly. Even so, he nodded. Go ahead. I walked toward his desk and gently placed the resignation letter in front of him. I'd like to resign. He picked up the letter and read it without saying anything. His eyes remained fixed on the page as he asked, Is this how you're choosing to deal with your problems? As far as I remember, running away was never your personality. My heart skipped a beat. Why had he said that? How could he know what my personality was like? Without thinking, I blurted out the question that instantly came to mind. How do you know what I'm like? For just a brief moment, he seemed caught off guard. He fell silent before answering, but instead of responding to my question, he deliberately changed the subject. We'll talk about that another time. For now, I can't approve your resignation. Go back to work. I immediately shook my head. I've already made up my mind. Even if you don't approve it, I'm still resigning. Nothing will change my decision. Andre slipped my resignation letter into a folder, stood up, and calmly looked at me. The project you're working on hasn't been completed yet. If you leave now, the company will lose millions of dollars. If you're able to compensate the company for that loss, I'll approve your resignation immediately." Hearing about the enormous amount of money the company would lose made my whole body tremble. With my modest salary, I could work for the rest of my life and still never earn enough to cover damages like that. Just like that, my determination to resign vanished in an instant. I had no choice but to return to work. Before leaving his office, however, I stubbornly looked at him and said, "Please keep my resignation letter. Once this project is finished, I hope you'll approve it." He nodded in agreement, and that gave me a little peace of mind. From that day forward, I avoided him completely. I didn't want to face him because I was afraid he would bring up everything that had happened. Besides, after all the gossip, everyone around the office was probably convinced there was something going on between us. Otherwise, Paige wouldn't have come to the company making such a scene. Staying away from Andre seemed like the quickest way to put an end to all the rumors. I didn't know whether those rumors had reached Ethan, but ever since then, he stopped being as warm and attentive toward me as before. He only attended meetings when necessary, and whenever we spoke, it was strictly about work. Surprisingly, that didn't bother me at all. In fact, it made me feel more comfortable because I no longer felt disturbed by his constant attention. Ever since Andre agreed to approve my resignation after the project was completed, I threw myself into work like a machine. I worked day and night without thinking about anything else. There were still nights when I stayed late, and Andre would quietly appear with hot tea and cake, just as he always had. But this time, I refused every single time. I wouldn't accept anything from him, and I barely spoke to him at all. I had to force myself to push him away completely. Finally, the day I had been waiting for arrived. That morning was our final project review meeting, marking the successful completion of everything we had worked so hard for. As soon as the meeting ended, I hurried straight to Andre's office and knocked on the door. It almost seemed as though he already knew it was me because he calmly called, "Aria, come in." I stepped inside. This time, I felt much calmer than I had during our last conversation. He remained seated behind his desk, waiting for me to speak first. "About what we discussed before, I'd like to ask you to approve my resignation." He gave a slight nod before standing up and slowly walking toward me. "That's tomorrow's matter. Today, there's still one thing you need to finish." He was referring to the celebration dinner that evening. I had planned to avoid it, but the dinner was being held to celebrate the project's success. On top of that, Andre had reminded me personally, so there was no realistic way for me to skip it. I reluctantly showed up at the celebration dinner that evening. This time, however, I took a taxi instead of riding with Andre, even though he had offered to give me a ride. I figured that once I resigned, tonight would also serve as my farewell party with everyone at the company. Thinking about it that way made it a little easier to face the evening. Having learned my lesson from the last dinner, I only drank soda this time. No matter who came over to offer a toast, I simply smiled politely and took a tiny sip. I refused to touch a single drop of alcohol. I still hadn't recovered from the embarrassment of getting drunk the last time. If I made a fool of myself again, I'd probably want the ground to swallow me whole. But before long, I noticed that Andre was drinking far more than anyone else. His face had already turned noticeably red, yet he continued raising his glass with one person after another. I couldn't help feeling worried. No matter how hard I tried to stay away from him, there hadn't been a single day when I had truly stopped caring about him. I quietly glanced around the room. Once I was sure no one was paying attention to me anymore, I slipped outside. At almost the exact same moment, Andre also stepped out, heading toward the restroom. The instant I saw him, I hurried after him and gently grabbed his arm. "Andre, you've had too much to drink." He slowly turned around to look at me. His eyes were already beginning to lose focus. In a low, hoarse voice, he asked, "You're worried about me?" As he spoke, he slowly leaned closer. His tall frame gradually pressed me back until my shoulders were against the wall. My heart immediately began pounding. He was so much bigger than I was that I had no way to push him away. Fortunately, just as his face was inches from mine, someone stepped outside and called my name. Only then did Andre finally let me go before silently walking away. A little while later, I returned to the dining room and saw him come back as well. His steps were noticeably unsteady now. It was obvious he hadn't listened to a word I had said. He picked up another glass and continued drinking as if nothing had happened. No matter how anxiously I watched him, he never stopped. The party gradually came to an end, and everyone began leaving one by one. I watched Andre stagger toward his car, and anxiety immediately filled my chest. In the condition he was in, letting him drive would be far too dangerous. Even though I was afraid of what people might say if they saw me stop him, his safety mattered more to me than the gossip. Just as I was about to walk over and stop him, Paige moved faster than I did. She stepped in front of me and hurried toward him. "Andre, you've had too much to drink. I don't think you should drive. Let me take you home." At that moment, I was so worried about his safety that I didn't notice anything unusual about Paige's behavior. I simply assumed she was concerned about him too. But Andre refused her outright. No matter how much she tried to persuade him, he wouldn't agree. Just then, the taxi I had called pulled up. Andre swayed as he walked toward me. His words were already slurred from the alcohol. "Aria, I'm tired. Take me home." After saying only those few words, he opened the taxi door himself and climbed into the back seat. Everyone immediately turned to look at me. No one actually said anything, but judging from their expressions, I was certain they had misunderstood the relationship between Andre and me. I didn't even have time to think about their stares because the driver urged me impatiently. "Miss, are you getting in or not? Hurry up." Left with no choice, I quickly climbed into the taxi, ignoring everyone's eyes on me. As I reached for the front passenger door, the driver stopped me. "Not there. Sit in the back. He's drunk. It's not safe to leave him sitting back there alone." The driver was right. Andre was already nodding off. Leaving him alone in the back seat really wasn't safe, so I quietly moved to the back and sat beside him. As soon as the taxi pulled away, it seemed as though he sensed I was sitting next to him. His entire body slowly leaned against mine. A moment later, his head came to rest on my shoulder as he drifted peacefully to sleep. In that moment, it felt as though my heart had stopped beating. After 10 long years, I was finally sitting this close to him again. Greedily, I turned my head and studied his face from only inches away. His warm breath brushed gently against my neck, making my cheeks grow hot. Simply looking at him no longer felt like enough to satisfy all the longing I had carried for the past decade. Before I realized what I was doing, I slowly reached out and gently touched his cheek. What startled me was that his hand suddenly closed tightly around mine. His eyes remained shut, yet he murmured softly, "Planning to take advantage of the fact that I'm drunk?" Embarrassed, I instinctively tried to pull my hand away, but his grip only tightened. I didn't dare struggle. I was afraid the driver would notice what was happening between us. So for the rest of the ride, I could only let my hand remain quietly enclosed within his large, steady one. After a while, Andre suddenly sat upright and said to the driver, "Pull over at the park up ahead." Maybe it was because he was drunk, but the driver looked uneasy at his request. I had no idea why he wanted to stop there, so I asked again, hoping he would change his mind. "Just tell me your address, and I'll take you home. It's late, and you've been drinking. Why stop at a park?" No matter how much I tried to persuade him, he stubbornly insisted on getting out there. Perhaps the driver didn't want any trouble from transporting a drunk passenger because, after Andre repeated the request several times, he finally pulled over by the side of the road and let us out. Since I was nearsighted, it was difficult for me to recognize places at night. At first, I had no idea which park this was, but the moment I stepped out of the taxi, I froze. This was the very park where Andre had brought me after my high school graduation 10 years ago. It was also the place I had returned to countless times throughout my college years. Whenever I missed him, I would come here alone, sit on that familiar bench, and quietly relive the memories that still hurt my heart. Andre never let go of my hand. Still holding it tightly, he led me straight toward the old bench. I stood there in shock. My heart began pounding, and before I knew it, a small spark of hope had crept into my chest. Could it be that he still remembered me? Otherwise, how could he have known this place? Lost in those thoughts, I obediently followed him. He helped me sit down on the bench before taking a seat beside me. Neither of us spoke. We simply sat there in silence. It was summertime again, just like it had been 10 years earlier. After a while, a gentle breeze swept through the park, sending clusters of paperbark blossoms drifting through the air. The old paperbark tree was still there, just as it had been all those years ago, and once again its blossoms floated softly onto my hair. Ever since Andre left, I had been the only one who returned to this place. Every time those blossoms landed on me, they reminded me of him, and every visit left my heart aching a little more. My eyes slowly filled with tears. Andre tilted his head back, letting the breeze and the falling blossoms brush across his face. Then he turned toward me. Gently lifting a strand of my long black hair, he brought it close and breathed in its scent before whispering softly, "It's still the same fragrance. So wonderful. Do you know how long I've missed this scent?" At that moment, the hope inside me grew even stronger. Maybe I had changed too much over the years for him to recognize me, but everything he had done tonight made me believe that somewhere in his heart, memories of me still remained. I looked at him and quietly asked, "Do you remember who I am?" This time, he didn't answer. Instead, he slowly rested his head against my shoulder and peacefully drifted off to sleep. Only then did I realize how foolish I had been. While he was still awake, I had forgotten to ask him where he lived. Now that he was asleep again, I had no idea how I was supposed to get him home. But leaving him here alone in the park, exposed to the night air in his condition, wasn't an option either. So once again, I reluctantly called another taxi to take us home. The entire ride back, I couldn't stop wondering what I should do. If I took Andre back to my apartment again, people would surely gossip even more than they already had. But taking him to a hotel required even more courage than I had. If someone happened to see us walking into a hotel together tonight, or even later tomorrow, there wouldn't be enough explanations in the world to clear my name. After thinking it through over and over, I finally decided to bring him back to my apartment. He had already been there once before, and the neighbors had already seen him. One more time probably wouldn't make much difference. Besides, tomorrow would be my last day at the company anyway, so I told myself this would be the last time. It took all my strength to help him into the apartment. His body was so much bigger than mine that I nearly lost my balance several times trying to support him. By the time I finally managed to get him inside, both of us were exhausted. Just as I was about to help him lie down on the bed, he suddenly pulled me into his arms. Before I could react, his lips crashed against mine. The kiss came without warning, fierce and overwhelming. At that instant, I completely forgot how to breathe. Yet instead of pulling away, I found myself unable to resist. I had dreamed about this moment for so many years. As my lips met his, the feeling was strangely familiar. It was exactly like the hazy dream I remembered from the night I had gotten drunk. For one impossible moment, I wished time would simply stop. My lips remained pressed against his, but deep inside my chest, an unbearable ache slowly spread through my heart. By the time his passionate kiss finally ended, I was almost out of breath. Only then did I manage to help him lie down properly on the bed. I spread a thin mat on the floor and decided to sleep there instead. I simply didn't have the courage to share the same bed with him. I had no idea what might happen if I did. Fortunately, once he was asleep, he remained completely still. He didn't toss, turn, or cause any trouble the way I had feared. At least that meant I could finally get some rest. It had been a long, exhausting day. Between the workload and the celebration dinner, I was completely worn out. The moment I lay down on the mat, I drifted into a deep sleep. I slept peacefully, even dreaming a beautiful dream. Somehow, I even felt warm despite sleeping on the floor. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed after a good night's rest. But just as I stretched and was about to sit up, I realized my entire body was wrapped securely in someone's arms. Startled, I looked over and found Andre lying beside me. I had no idea when he had climbed down from the bed to sleep next to me during the night. Feeling me stir, he slowly opened his eyes as well. When he realized I was lying in his arms, he remained completely calm, unlike me, who was frozen in embarrassment. It seemed as though he remembered everything that had happened. While I was still staring at him with wide eyes, he spoke first. You were using my arm as a pillow. I couldn't move. My face instantly turned bright red. Only then did I realize I had been resting my head on his arm, curled up comfortably against his chest. I hurriedly sat up and avoided looking at him. Watching him massage his arm to relieve the numbness only made me feel even more embarrassed. The more flustered I became, the calmer he seemed, and somehow that only irritated me. Last night, I had struggled so much because he was drunk, yet now he was acting as though nothing had happened. I turned to him and complained, "Don't you remember how drunk you were last night?" He looked at me, then smiled. "It's only fair. The last time you got drunk, you put me through the same thing. Let's call it even." After saying that, he said goodbye and left, leaving me sitting there alone, completely speechless. Before he walked out the door, he didn't forget to remind me, "Don't be late for work this morning." Of course, he didn't need to remind me. I already knew I had to be at the office on time because I had something important to take care of. Today, I was going to resign. I arrived at the office early. I organized the pile of documents scattered across my desk and carefully wrote down notes about every unfinished task so I could hand everything over to whoever replaced me. Seeing me cleaning out my workspace so early in the morning, Khan looked at me in surprise. "What's going on? Why are you packing up your desk?" I smiled faintly before answering, "I'm resigning today." My words immediately caused a stir throughout the office. Paige quickly stood up and walked over to me. "You're really resigning? But why?" I couldn't help feeling surprised. For so long, Paige had been distant and cold toward me, yet now she had come over to ask about me herself. Perhaps it was only because she had heard I was leaving. Still, it made me feel a little sad. The rest of my coworkers were just as shocked. Everyone gathered around, asking questions and telling me how sorry they were to see me leave. Only then did I realize how many people at the company genuinely cared about me. While everyone was still talking, Susan walked into the office. She asked everyone to quiet down before making an announcement. "Everyone, may I have your attention? Management has made a decision. Starting today, Aria will be transferred to the executive secretary position. All of her unfinished accounting work will be handed over to Paige." But I submitted my resignation. I stared at Susan in disbelief. She simply smiled awkwardly and shook her head. "I don't know anything about that. This decision came directly from upper management. If you have any questions, you'll have to ask the director." The moment she finished speaking, the entire office erupted into applause. Everyone crowded around to congratulate me. "Congratulations, Aria. You did such an amazing job on the project. No wonder management noticed you. See? Why resign now? This deserves a celebration." None of their congratulations reached my ears. At that moment, the only thing I noticed was the furious glare Paige was directing at me from across the room. I quickly excused myself from Susan and marched straight toward Andre's office. This time, I didn't even bother knocking before pushing the door open. I was furious. He had broken his promise to me. The moment the door swung open, he looked up as though he had already expected me to come storming in. Since I had already decided to resign no matter what, I no longer cared about holding back. "Why did you break your promise?" I demanded. He waited quietly until my anger had settled a little before answering in his usual calm voice. "I kept my promise." I frowned. "How?" "I promised you that you wouldn't have to keep working in the accounting department. And now you won't?" I stared at him in disbelief. I had never met anyone as unreasonable as he was. He had clearly meant one thing, and then twisted his own words into something completely different. Before I could continue arguing, he spoke again. "So, do you accept the new position?" "No," I answered without hesitation. I had already prepared myself to fight this through to the very end. Determined, I stepped closer, ready to tell him exactly what I was thinking. But before I could say another word, something caught my eye. A purple fountain pen was peeking out from beneath a stack of documents on his desk. The anger inside me disappeared in an instant, replaced by another wave of doubt. Little by little, all the strange things Andre had done were beginning to connect in my mind. If I walked away now, I knew I would never be at peace. If he had truly forgotten me, then I could eventually accept that. But this uncertainty, these hints that he might still remember, I couldn't let them go. I needed to know the truth. Right then, I made my decision. Even if the truth turned out to be that he had forgotten me completely, I still wanted to hear it from him myself. So in the end, I decided to stay. I returned to the office, surrounded by my coworkers' congratulations, but all I received from Paige was another cold stare. It was obvious now that she openly disliked me. Even when I took the initiative to meet with her and hand over my accounting work, she always found an excuse to avoid me. Even the emails I sent went unanswered. I wasn't angry about the way she treated me. I didn't believe she was a bad person. Before all of this, we had been close friends. What saddened me was how much she had changed. I was afraid of losing a friend. My new desk was placed right beside Andre's office. From where he sat, all he had to do was glance diagonally across the room to see me immediately. The work he assigned me wasn't overwhelming. Most of it involved reviewing documents for him and accompanying him to meetings with clients. Since the workload wasn't heavy, I found myself with even more opportunities to quietly observe him and search for the answers I had been looking for. That afternoon after work, Susan invited me out for coffee. During our conversation, she casually mentioned something that caught me completely off guard. Back then, Andre was the one who personally asked me to assign that project to you. She slowly stirred her coffee and smiled at me. At first, I thought he was simply showing favoritism, but after seeing what you accomplished, I realized he had good judgment all along. I sat there speechless. Hearing that only deepened my suspicion that Andre hadn't forgotten me after all. Before we went home, Susan invited me to the spa. We washed our hair, chatted about work, and she wished me success in my new position. The next morning, as soon as I arrived at the office, Andre frowned slightly the moment he saw me. "When did you change your shampoo?" I looked at him in confusion. "I didn't." He walked over, leaned closer, and gently smelled my hair as if trying to make sure. Then he said with certainty, "You're denying it. You used to wash your hair with the shampoo you used before. This smells different." I looked at him in disbelief. "You don't like it?" "No," he answered quietly. "I like the scent of pomelo blossoms." For a brief moment, it seemed as though he had completely let his guard down. He had forgotten that only one person in the world should have known I had always washed my hair with pomelo blossoms. I had never abandoned that habit. I didn't say another word, but inside, I became more certain than ever that my suspicions were right. About 2 weeks later, the company announced a vacation for all employees. I immediately decided that I wouldn't be joining them. I had planned to use the few vacation days to go home and visit my family. But somehow, it seemed as though Andre had already guessed what I intended to do. He announced to everyone that this company trip would also serve as a celebration for my promotion to my new position. With a reason like that, there was no way I could possibly be absent. I didn't pack many clothes since the trip would only last 3 days. Besides, we were going to the beach, and I had never been comfortable in crowded places like that. I was even offered the chance to ride in a private car with Andre to the resort, but I felt too self-conscious about what everyone might think, so I firmly insisted on taking the company bus instead. The biggest surprise came just after I found my seat. Andre suddenly appeared on the bus as well, dressed in casual beach clothes, a pair of shorts and a light shirt. He looked completely different from his usual serious self, and everyone couldn't help admiring how handsome he looked. I quickly turned to stare out the window, pretending not to notice him at all. Fortunately, someone was already sitting beside me, leaving only one empty seat on the entire bus, the one next to Paige. With obvious reluctance, Andre took that seat. Even so, the way we were seated meant that he was directly across from me, and all he had to do was glance sideways to see me. I noticed Paige looked especially happy. She eagerly kept trying to start conversations with him, but after a while, perhaps he found the constant chatter too much. He quietly put on his headphones and listened to his own music instead. I absent-mindedly watched the rows of trees outside swaying as they rushed past the windows. After a while, I began to feel sleepy. Just as I looked over toward him again, I froze at what I saw. Paige had fallen asleep with her head resting on his shoulder. To anyone else, it looked completely accidental. But I noticed that every so often, her eyes secretly cracked open for just a second. She wasn't asleep at all. The realization made something inside me twist painfully. Before I knew it, an overwhelming wave of jealousy and irritation rose inside my heart. Since I was Andre's executive secretary, my room was assigned right next to his in a separate area from the rest of the employees. After everyone checked in, the entire company gathered on the beach for team-building games. I had never liked activities like that, so I hadn't prepared anything special. The moment I stepped onto the beach, I immediately felt completely out of place in my shorts and t-shirt because everyone else was wearing swimsuits. I noticed Paige confidently walking around in a two-piece bikini that perfectly showed off her stunning figure. She kept strolling back and forth in front of the men from the company. Even I, as another woman, had to admit she looked beautiful, let alone all the men around us. Susan clicked her tongue the moment she saw me. Honestly, Aria, who goes to the beach dressed like that? Embarrassed, I scratched the back of my head and smiled awkwardly. I'm just not comfortable dressing any differently. This feels better to me. But Susan had no intention of letting me get away with it. She immediately grabbed my wrist. No way! Come with me! She practically dragged me back to her room before pulling a swimsuit out of her suitcase. We're about the same size. Put this on. I firmly refused, but she stubbornly insisted until I finally gave in. Standing in front of the mirror, I couldn't help sighing softly. I had never worn anything so revealing in my entire life. The swimsuit exposed far more skin than I was used to, and I suddenly felt too embarrassed to walk outside wearing it. Fortunately, I spotted one of Susan's sheer beach wraps. I quickly wrapped it clumsily around myself, trying to cover as much of my body as possible. When we returned to the beach together, everyone stared at me in surprise. Khan burst into applause with a loud laugh. Now that's more like it. You finally look like a young woman. You've been dressing so conservatively all this time that none of us realized you're actually gorgeous. Everyone began complimenting me one after another. I could only smile awkwardly to myself. They were all so strange. I felt incredibly uncomfortable dressed like this, yet everyone kept praising me. Maybe they were only trying to encourage me. Just then, a strong gust of sea breeze suddenly swept my wrap away. My entire figure was revealed beneath the gentle golden morning sunlight. Standing beside me, Susan patted my shoulder and smiled. Our director really does have good taste. Beautiful and talented. Flustered, I hurried to pick up the wrap and quickly covered myself again. As I bent down, I happened to glance toward the coconut trees nearby. Andre was reclining on a lounge chair beneath the shade. It seemed as though he had been watching me the entire time, and I could clearly see the faint smile curling at the corner of his lips. That evening, we held a beach party. Our company wasn't very large, so everything was informal. Everyone grilled food together, ate, drank, sang, and enjoyed the night. I wasn't comfortable singing or dancing, so I volunteered to stay by the barbecue grill. I quietly stood there, turning each skewer of meat over the fire while the delicious aroma filled the air. Every now and then, I looked up to watch everyone cheering and dancing together on the stage. Andre wasn't participating either. He was standing on the opposite side from me, grilling food as well. From time to time, coworkers walked over to invite him for a drink. I could hear glasses clinking together, and whenever I did, I couldn't help glancing over at him. I was afraid he might drink too much again like he had before. As the party grew livelier, several coworkers also came over to toast me and congratulate me on my promotion. From a distance, Paige approached with a warm smile and spoke to me as though nothing had ever happened between us. Aria, let's have a drink together. I still couldn't help feeling a little cautious. Her sudden change was simply too strange. Just that morning, she had been looking at me with obvious hostility, and for the past several months she had treated me coldly. Yet now she was taking the initiative to speak with me so warmly. I didn't think badly of her. Her sudden change simply made me uneasy. Perhaps she sensed what I was thinking because she held out her glass again and smiled. I just wanted to congratulate you. Congratulations on your new position. I hesitated before accepting the glass. I clinked mine lightly against hers and only intended to take a small sip, but Paige had already emptied hers. What's wrong, Aria? Don't you want me here? Afraid she might misunderstand, I immediately waved my hand. No, that's not it. I'm just a little tired today, so I really can't drink much. She pouted and said in a hurt voice, You're still holding a grudge over everything that's happened lately, aren't you? That's why you don't even want to accept my congratulations. After going back and forth for a while, Paige insisted that I finish the entire glass. She said that if I refused to drink, it meant I didn't respect her. The distance between us over the past months had already saddened me. I didn't want another misunderstanding to destroy the friendship we'd built ever since I first joined the company. So I stopped overthinking it and finished the entire glass of wine she had handed me in one swallow. After making a round to greet everyone, I looked into the distance and saw Andre raising a glass with several business partners. They had joined our company's beach party that evening. The sea breeze seemed stronger tonight, and after the long ride earlier, I gradually began to feel lightheaded. Back then, I had been a terrible drinker, but after accompanying Andre to client meetings so many times, my tolerance had improved quite a bit. Even so, something felt very strange tonight. I had only finished one glass of wine, and aside from that, I had merely taken a few small sips here and there, yet my head was already spinning. The ocean breeze continued blowing against me, but instead of feeling cool, my entire body grew unbearably hot. Maybe I was already drunk. Everything in front of my eyes slowly became blurred. The people around me faded into hazy silhouettes. A strange, restless feeling spread through my body. I couldn't even describe what it was. I only knew that I felt unbearably uncomfortable. I was so hot that I wanted nothing more than to throw myself into a tub of ice-cold water right then and there. Clutching my head, I staggered toward the hotel, trying to make my way back to my room. It was already quite late, and people had begun drifting back one by one, so hardly anyone noticed me leaving. I walked unsteadily through the hallway, forcing my eyes to stay open because I was afraid of going to the wrong room. Just as I struggled toward what I thought was my door, someone suddenly grabbed my wrist. Alarmed, I turned around and found myself facing a man I had never seen before. Seeing my flushed face and dazed condition, the stranger's expression gradually turned inappropriate. Tightening his grip on my wrist, he smiled and said in a disgusting tone, "Where are you going? If you're not feeling well, let me take you back to your room." I didn't know who he was, and his shameless behavior terrified me even more as he grabbed my arm and tried to pull me closer. I struggled to pull away, but the hotter my body became, the weaker I felt. My vision blurred, my limbs felt unbearably heavy, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't summon the strength to fight him off. Every time his hand brushed against my skin, an unbearable wave of relief spread through me. I couldn't understand what was happening. My mind wanted to resist, but I could no longer control my own body. With the last bit of awareness I had left, I forced my eyes open and spotted the number 303 ahead of me. Gathering every ounce of strength I had, I violently tore myself free and ran straight toward that room. It was my room, or at least I believed it was. Thankfully, the door wasn't locked. The moment I reached it, it swung open. I rushed inside in panic and slammed the door shut behind me. Outside the door, I could still hear the man pounding on it. Furious that his prey had slipped away, he cursed loudly and kicked the door over and over. The room was completely dark, but I was already too exhausted to bother turning on the lights. I dragged my heavy body toward the bed and collapsed onto it. Even though the mattress was soft and comfortable, my body only grew hotter. Sweat soaked through my clothes within moments. The burning sensation spread deeper and deeper until it felt as though every muscle and every inch of my skin were swelling with unbearable heat. I had never experienced anything like this before. It felt as though thousands of ants were crawling beneath my skin. Curling into myself, I hugged a pillow tightly, trying to endure the overwhelming discomfort as sweat soaked through my clothes. Gradually, my consciousness slipped into delirium. I dreamed that Andre was sitting quietly beside me, gently holding my hand while softly calling my name. Somehow, his quiet presence eased the fear and discomfort that had consumed me. I jerked awake, only to realize that I had been tossing and turning beneath the blanket. One dream after another came crashing over me until I could no longer tell whether I was awake or still dreaming. Then, through the haze, I saw him lying down beside me. He looked at me quietly. I smiled to myself, thinking that I had simply fallen into another dream. But this dream felt unbelievably real. I could clearly feel his fingers slowly tracing the bridge of my nose. I even heard him whisper my name. After so many dreams in a row, I no longer cared whether any of it was real. If it was only a dream, then there was nothing to be afraid of. Wrapping my arms around him, I clung to him as though he were the only thing keeping me grounded. In my dream, I no longer cared whether any of it was real. I only knew that his presence made me feel safe. I held on to him desperately, hoping the fear and unbearable discomfort would finally end. He stayed beside me without saying a word, and somehow that quiet reassurance was enough. Little by little, the burning sensation inside me began to ease. My breathing grew steadier, my thoughts drifted farther away, and overwhelming exhaustion finally carried me into a deep, peaceful sleep. I could sense that morning had arrived, but the soft bed felt so comfortable that I didn't want to wake up yet. I buried myself deeper beneath the blanket, savoring the warmth of the pillow. Little by little, memories of the unbearable torment from last night drifted back into my mind, followed by those incredibly vivid dreams. The more I remembered them, the more embarrassed I became. Yet at the same time, I couldn't help feeling reluctant to let them go. I curled up beneath the blanket, trying to hide from my own thoughts. Then I suddenly felt a strange ache throughout my body. Before I had time to understand what was happening, a voice beside me made me freeze. "It's not even morning yet. Let me sleep a little longer. You kept me awake all night." What? What did he just say? My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the voice. Andre was lying beside me with only the blanket loosely covering him, sleeping peacefully with his back facing me. Panic surged through me. I quickly pulled the blanket over myself, only to realize my clothes were nowhere to be found. The room was in complete disarray, making it obvious that something unusual had happened during the night. Terror washed over me, and tears immediately filled my eyes. I desperately tried to remember everything, but my mind was completely blank. I had believed everything that happened last night had only been a dream. Seeing me trembling on the verge of tears, Andre reached over and gently pulled me closer. "Don't think too much. Lie back down and get some rest." But how could I possibly stay calm? He was a man. He hadn't lost anything. But for me, nothing like this had ever happened to me before. I shot upright and shouted at him through my tears. "Why are you here? How could you come into my room and do this to me?" As soon as the words left my mouth, I broke down crying. Andre quickly sat up and tried to comfort me. After waiting for me to calm down a little, he finally explained, "This is my room. You're the one who came into my room." His words left me completely speechless. I hurriedly looked around. Only then did I realize he was telling the truth. Embarrassment flooded through me. I desperately tried to remember what had happened the previous night, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember a single thing. Seeing me clutching my head in misery, he wrapped his arms around me and spoke gently. "What happened last night wasn't normal. I'll have someone investigate it. And as for what happened between us, I'll take responsibility." Tears still shimmered in my eyes as I looked up at him. He was so close that I could hear my own heart pounding. Summoning all my courage, I asked the question I had wanted to ask for so long. "The truth is, you still remember me, don't you?" A trace of hesitation flickered across his face. Before he could answer, I continued firmly. "You can't deny it anymore. I saw everything you kept. You still remember all my little habits. Then why have you been lying to me?" Faced with my accusation, he fell silent. The more he hesitated, the more convinced I became that I was right. Frustrated, I finally shouted, "If you're still going to keep denying me after everything that's happened, then I don't need your so-called responsibility." I turned to leave, but before I could take another step, he reached out and wrapped his arms around me from behind. Holding me tightly, he whispered, "I have my reasons. Seeing you standing right in front of me, yet not being able to tell you the truth, do you know how much that hurts me?" I turned around and looked into his eyes, silently waiting for an explanation. Still holding me gently, he finally began telling me what had really happened all those years ago. It turned out that on that night, his mother had suddenly fallen seriously ill, and he had been forced to rush back to his hometown immediately. But at that time, my family was so poor that we didn't even have enough money to save my mother. Andre's voice was calm, but every word carried years of pain. She was lying there, growing weaker every day, waiting to die. Then my father appeared. That was the first time I had ever met him. He told me that years ago, his parents had fallen in love and had him together. But his father's family was wealthy and influential, so they refused to accept a poor woman as their daughter-in-law. In the end, his father had no choice but to obey his family's wishes and marry someone else. Yet, after more than 20 years of marriage, they still had no children. That was why his father had finally come back to claim him. Back then, I didn't know whether he still loved my mother or whether he cared about me at all, Andre said quietly. But I didn't have the luxury of thinking about those things. The condition he gave me was simple. If I agreed to return with him, he would pay for my mother's treatment. After that, Andre received a scholarship to attend a university overseas. His father arranged for him to study abroad immediately. In the rush to return home that night, he accidentally lost the piece of paper with my family's phone number written on it. Throughout all those years overseas, he never stopped thinking about me. By the time he returned to the country, his father wanted him to take over a new branch in the southern region. The moment he learned it was in the south, he secretly hoped he might somehow find me again. Fate brought us together once more when he came across my job application and decided to hire me himself. "The first day I saw you again," he admitted softly, "all I wanted was to run over and hold you after missing you for so many years." But his father had already arranged his marriage to Madison. He didn't have the courage to approach me because he was afraid he would only hurt me again. So instead, he stayed quietly by my side every single day. He told me that seeing me still treasure the gifts he had given me, seeing that I had never abandoned the little habits he loved, made him happier than I could ever imagine. All he could do was endure everything in silence while postponing his marriage to Madison and working hard to prove himself through his own abilities. Only then, after earning the right to make his own decisions, would he dare stand before me, confess his feelings openly, and proudly bring me home to meet his family. "But I guess I wasn't very good at hiding it," he said with a helpless smile. "You figured it out anyway." We sat together for hours, telling each other everything that had happened over the past 10 years. We shared each other's pain, comforted each other's regrets, and finally understood everything that had remained unspoken for so long. From that day forward, we truly belonged to each other. Even so, our relationship still had to remain a secret. As for my strange behavior the previous night, Andre admitted that it had already made him suspicious. He told me to act as though nothing had happened while he quietly investigated everything himself. I quickly left Andre's room. Just as we had agreed, I acted as though nothing had happened and continued participating in the company's activities as usual. After what had happened the previous night, Paige seemed noticeably friendlier toward me. The moment she saw me, she walked over with a smile. "Aria, when did you go back to your room last night? I didn't even notice." I was still exhausted after everything that had happened, so I simply answered her with a few vague words before lying back down to rest. A little while later, Andre appeared as well. Everyone immediately gathered around to greet him and chat. I noticed Paige enthusiastically handing him a bottle of water. Since Andre and I had already agreed beforehand, I merely glanced at him once before pretending he didn't exist and quietly closed my eyes again. By the end of the day, our company trip came to an end, and everyone returned to the city. Seeing how exhausted I looked, Andre used the excuse that the company had an urgent matter to handle and drove back ahead of everyone else with me in his car. Early the very next morning, he already had the results of his investigation into my strange behavior that night. It turned out that Paige had secretly slipped something into the glass of wine she handed me, causing me to completely lose control of myself. Even the strange man who had tried to take advantage of me that night had been arranged by her. Tears streamed down my face as I looked through the security camera footage. I couldn't believe that the friend I had always treasured could do something so cruel to me. I walked outside and sat alone for a long time, staring blankly ahead. I didn't know how I was supposed to face Paige anymore. I was afraid the hurt and anger inside me would make me do something I would regret. After crying until I had no tears left, I wiped my face clean and walked back into the office. I stopped in front of Paige's desk and quietly asked, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" She had probably already learned that morning that her carefully planned scheme had failed. She no longer bothered pretending to be warm and friendly toward me. Looking at me with open annoyance, she snapped, "What are you talking about? If you've got nothing to say, then go somewhere else. I'm working." Before I could answer, Susan's voice interrupted us. "Paige, you don't need to worry about work anymore. Starting today, you won't be working here." Paige shot to her feet in shock. "What do you mean?" She looked completely unable to believe what she had just heard. Susan slowly walked toward us, holding the same security photos I had already seen earlier that morning. "This company can accept employees who aren't the strongest professionally," she said firmly. "But we will never tolerate employees who lack integrity." After saying that, she turned and walked away, leaving only Paige and me standing there. Fighting back my tears, I looked at her and asked, "We were friends. Why would you do this to me?" Perhaps because she had already lost everything, she finally stopped pretending. She looked directly at me and laughed bitterly. "Friends? I thought you were my friend too. But why was it that we joined the company at the same time, yet you were always luckier than me? Why were you always the one everyone favored?" She glared at me with hatred. "That's right. I tried to ruin you. I hated you." After pouring out every bit of resentment she had been carrying, Paige packed up her belongings and walked away without looking back. I remained standing alone in the office. The pain of being betrayed by someone I had once considered my closest friend hurt every bit as much as losing someone I loved. It took me a very long time before I was finally able to let go of what Paige had done. As for Andre and me, we continued loving each other in secret. Ever since I officially accepted his love, I never saw Madison appear again. Even so, I couldn't stop feeling uneasy. Deep down, I still felt as though I were the third person standing between the two of them. Sometime later, Andre happily told me that Madison was getting married. Perhaps she had finally accepted his firm rejection, or perhaps she had found someone better. Although he shared the news with a smile, I couldn't bring myself to feel relieved. I knew that even without Madison, there would always be someone else. Andre still didn't have the courage to take me home and introduce me to his father. Lately, I had been thinking constantly about our relationship, and the uncertainty had left me emotionally drained. So I asked Andre for a week's vacation to go home and visit my family. I even hinted that he should come with me, but it seemed he wasn't ready for that yet. He only drove me to the entrance of my neighborhood before saying he had work to do and leaving. His hesitation saddened me so much that after I got home, I barely replied to his messages out of sheer frustration. Being back with my family gradually lifted my spirits. Our family restaurant had continued operating all these years. Since we had been in business for so long, we had many loyal customers, and both my parents genuinely loved what they did. My grandparents were much older now and mostly stayed home. My grandfather had also grown quite frail over the past few years, so my father had brought him to live nearby so he could take care of him. He lived only a few miles from our house. I had been home for 2 days when, early Tuesday morning, loud voices outside woke me up. Sleepily, I walked downstairs and immediately froze. My aunt and my grandmother were standing at the front door. Time had changed all of our appearances, but voices never truly changed. The moment I heard them, I recognized them instantly. All the painful memories from my childhood came rushing back. Fear gripped me as I instinctively stepped behind my mother. She looked just as tense as I felt. I noticed her hands trembling as she tightly clasped them together. After all these years, my father seemed to have finally let go of much of the bitterness he had carried. Even so, his attitude remained distant. He politely invited my grandmother and aunt inside to sit down while my mother and I quietly stood behind him. As the conversation unfolded, I learned that my cousin had grown up without ever settling down. Instead of working honestly, he had squandered all of the family's land and property before eventually throwing both my grandmother and my aunt out of the house. I listened as my grandmother sobbed. She admitted that she deeply regretted the way she had treated me all those years ago. She had loved my other cousins more than me, never imagining that one day they would be the very people to turn their backs on her. Now she had nothing left and nowhere to go, so she had come all the way here hoping my parents would take them in. My father was caught between his own mother and his wife. One glance at my mother's trembling hands was enough to understand how deeply the past had scarred her. But my mother had always been a kind and forgiving woman. In the end, she chose to set aside all the pain she had suffered and welcomed my grandmother and my aunt to live together with my grandfather. Even so, I noticed the sadness in my mother's eyes. She still looked uncertain, as though the old wounds had never completely healed. I stayed angry with Andre for almost an entire week. To be exact, I hadn't contacted him at all since returning home. During those days, I spent nearly all my time in the small room where he had once rented a place years ago, thinking over everything between us. The more I thought about our relationship, the more uncertain it seemed. I loved him deeply, but somehow it all felt so fragile. After nearly a week of thinking, I finally made up my mind. When I returned to the city, I would break up with him. Maybe that would be better for both of us. That morning, while I was helping my mother at the restaurant, another customer walked in and took a seat. I was so busy that I greeted him automatically without looking up. "Good morning. What would you like to order?" But when I finally raised my head, I froze. It was Andre. My father recognized him immediately. Smiling broadly, he hurried over and wrapped him in a warm hug. "You disappeared without a word all these years." My mother was just as happy to see him. She quickly brought him a meal while chatting with him as though no time had passed. Watching the scene unfold felt exactly like it had 10 years ago. After breakfast, Andre walked around the house, quietly looking at everything. When he saw that my parents had carefully preserved the small room he had once lived in exactly as it had been, he was deeply moved. The only thing I couldn't understand was why he had suddenly appeared here. I followed him outside and quietly asked, "Why did you come?" He simply smiled at me. "I came to find you. What if you decided to leave me?" After teasing me, he gently pulled me into his arms and whispered, "This past week without hearing from you made me realize a lot of things. I know you've suffered too much in this relationship. I know you've been hurt because I was too much of a coward to face my father. That's why I came today. I want to stop running away. I want to fight for us." After looking around the house, Andre sat down with my parents. Once everyone was settled, he spoke respectfully. "Mr. and Mrs. Michael, this time I came here for 2 reasons. First, I wanted to visit everyone. Second," he took a deep breath before continuing, "I'd like your permission to court Aria with the intention of marrying her someday." My father's face immediately lit up. He had always liked Andre, so he agreed without hesitation. My mother smiled as well, but I could tell she still wasn't completely at ease. That night, before I returned to the city, she came into my room. Holding me tightly, she whispered that she worried about me. Having experienced the hardships of marriage herself, she was afraid I would one day suffer the same pain she had endured. I spent a long time reassuring her before she finally felt a little more at peace. The thing I feared most was meeting Andre's father. Even though Andre had already told me a little about him beforehand, the closer we got to his house, the more nervous I became. His enormous home only made the pressure feel even greater. I had carefully prepared myself for this meeting, but the moment I sat across from his father, all my courage disappeared. I was so tense that I couldn't say a single word. He looked like a very strict man. Throughout the entire meeting, he carefully observed me without saying much. Andre looked just as nervous. Respectfully, he spoke first. "Dad, this is Aria, the woman I love. I brought her here today because I want to introduce her to you, and I hope you'll give us your blessing." His father remained silent, sitting with his arms folded across his chest as though waiting for me to speak. After gathering my courage, I finally broke the silence. "Sir, I hope you'll accept us. I believe that only when love comes from both people can true happiness exist." He grew thoughtful after hearing my words. I wasn't sure whether it was because of what I had said or because my words reminded him of his own past. A few moments later, his expression gradually softened, and he began speaking with me more openly. As we continued talking, he suddenly looked at me curiously and asked, "What's your father's name?" His question caught me by surprise, but I answered calmly, "My father's name is Michael." His eyes immediately lit up. "Michael? Is he from Richmond?" I nodded gently. His face broke into an excited smile. "No wonder you looked so familiar the moment I saw you. You look just like your father when he was young." I stared at him in surprise. "You know my father?" "Know him?" He laughed. "Your father and I served in the military together years ago." At that moment, both Andre and I finally relaxed. Neither of us had ever imagined that fate would connect our families in such an unexpected way. That very day, Andre's father went with us to my parents' house. The moment he and my father saw each other again after so many years, they embraced warmly and spent hours reminiscing about their days in the military. Watching them together, I suddenly realized that the distance between our two families had quietly disappeared. It took us some time to grow accustomed to finally being able to love each other openly. As the days passed, I felt Andre's love more deeply than ever before. One evening, I invited him to go for a walk with me, but he told me he was busy. Although I felt a little disappointed, I went alone anyway. Without thinking, my feet carried me back to the familiar park. After wandering around for a while, I stopped beside the same old bench where we had spent so many precious moments together. A strong breeze swept through the park, sending paperbark blossoms drifting gently through the air. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, breathing in the familiar fragrance of the flowers. Suddenly, I felt a pair of arms wrap gently around me from behind. Startled, I opened my eyes and found Andre standing there. Beneath the sky filled with drifting paperbark blossoms and the soft evening wind, he slowly knelt before me and held out a sparkling engagement ring. "This is the place where I wanted to do this 10 years ago." Looking into my eyes, he smiled gently. "Will you marry me?" I didn't even realize when the tears began rolling down my cheeks. Covering my mouth to hold back my sobs, I could only nod before throwing my arms around him. At that moment, I was so overwhelmingly happy that no words could possibly describe how I felt. A short time later, we were married, surrounded by the joyful blessings of our family and friends. Dressed once again in a pure white wedding gown, I stood shyly beside him, holding his hand as we stepped forward together into a beautiful future. On that happiest day of my life, I realized that waiting for 10 years had never been in vain. Because in the end, true love is a love that knows how to wait. And when love and faith remain strong enough, destiny will one day allow that love to bloom. 10 years of waiting has come to an end. Even though Andre and Aria never made a promise to wait for each other, their first love remained sincere enough to survive time, distance, and every challenge life placed in their way. In the end, their unwavering love brought them back to one another and gave them the happy ending they had both long deserved. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and follow Olivia for more heartfelt stories. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.